Long before modern prisons, there was the Iron Maiden. Travel back 600 years to medieval Europe, where punishment was public spectacle and torture was considered justice. For the next 3 hours, witness the darkest chapter of human cruelty. This is the horrific truth about medieval punishments revealed. If you're here for the unfiltered truth about history's most brutal punishments, you're in the right place. I'm covering the explicit details and psychological warfare tactics that most channels won't touch. Hit subscribe so you don't miss next video, where I will reveal something more interesting. Now, let's dive in. Welcome to medieval Europe, a time spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, where the concept of justice was fundamentally different from anything we understand today. In our modern world, we speak of rehabilitation, due process, and human rights. But in medieval times, punishment served an entirely different purpose. It was meant to terrify, to dominate, and to serve as a public reminder of the absolute power held by those in authority. Imagine walking through the streets of a medieval city on execution day. The smell of unwashed bodies mixed with the metallic scent of blood. The sound of crowds gathering, not in protest, but in anticipation of entertainment. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders to get a better view. Vendors selling food and drink as if it were a festival. This was the reality of medieval justice, a system where punishment was inseparable from public spectacle. The medieval mind operated on principles that seem alien to us now. The concept of proportional punishment, of making the penalty fit the crime in a measured way, was largely absent. Instead, punishments were designed to match the severity of the offense through symbolic violence. A thief might lose a hand, a liar might have their tongue removed, a traitor would suffer the most elaborate and prolonged death imaginable, their body literally torn apart as a symbol of their torn allegiance. But we must understand the context of this brutality. Medieval Europe was a world of constant uncertainty. Life expectancy was short, often not exceeding 30 or 40 years. Disease was rampant and poorly understood. Famine could strike without warning. Violence was commonplace. War, banditry, and local conflicts meant that death was never far away. In this environment, the law had to be terrifying to be effective. Without a modern police force, without forensic science, without the infrastructure of justice we take for granted, medieval authorities relied on fear as their primary tool of social control. The feudal system that dominated medieval Europe created a rigid hierarchy. At the top sat kings and nobles, beneath them the knights and clergy, and at the bottom, the peasants who made up the vast majority of the population. Justice was administered by those at the top, and it was deeply unequal. A nobleman accused of a crime might face trial by combat, where he could hire a champion to fight on his behalf. A peasant accused of the same crime might be tortured until they confessed, whether guilty or not, and then executed in the most brutal manner available. The church played a central role in this system of punishment. Medieval Christianity held that earthly suffering could purify the soul, preparing it for salvation. This theological framework provided a justification for torture and brutal execution. If pain could save a soul from eternal damnation, then the torturer was, in a twisted sense, performing a sacred duty. The Inquisition, which we will explore in detail later in this documentary, took this logic to its extreme, using torture systematically to extract confessions of heresy and witchcraft. Medieval punishments were also deeply performative. They were theater, carefully staged events designed to communicate messages to the watching crowd. When a criminal was executed, it was not simply a matter of ending their life efficiently. The method of death, the location, the timing, the involvement of different officials, all of these elements carried meaning. A public execution in the town square sent a different message than a private beheading in a castle courtyard. Drawing and quartering, which we will examine in depth, was reserved for traitors precisely because its elaborate brutality symbolized the complete destruction of someone who had betrayed their lord or king. The technology of punishment in medieval times was sophisticated in its cruelty. Devices were invented specifically to maximize pain while prolonging life. The rack stretched bodies until joints separated. The breaking wheel crushed bones systematically. The Iron Maiden, whether it truly existed or was a later invention, captured the medieval imagination with its image of death by 1,000 punctures. These devices were not simply tools of execution. They were instruments of psychological warfare, objects whose very existence in a castle dungeon could inspire terror and extract confessions. But who were the victims of these punishments? The answer reveals much about medieval society. Common criminals, those guilty of theft or assault, faced harsh penalties, but they were not typically subjected to the most elaborate tortures. Those were reserved for crimes against the social order itself: heresy, treason, witchcraft, and crimes that challenged the authority of church or state. The medieval justice system was fundamentally about preserving hierarchy and power, not about proportional response to harm done. Women faced particular vulnerabilities in this system. Accusations of witchcraft fell disproportionately on women, especially those who were elderly, unmarried, or otherwise outside the protection of male relatives. The punishments for convicted witches were among the most brutal in the medieval arsenal, often involving burning at the stake. The gendered nature of medieval punishment reflected the deeply patriarchal structure of medieval society, where women had few rights and little recourse against false accusations. The role of the executioner in medieval society was complex and fascinating. These individuals were simultaneously essential and reviled. They performed a necessary social function, but their contact with death and blood made them ritually unclean in the eyes of many. Executioners often lived in special quarters, were required to wear distinctive clothing, and could not enter certain establishments. Yet they were also skilled craftsmen, experts in anatomy and the mechanics of death. A good executioner could kill cleanly with a single sword stroke. A bad one, or one who had been bribed, could make death agonizingly slow. Medieval law itself was a patchwork of different systems and traditions. Roman law survived in some regions. Germanic tribal customs influenced others. Canon law, the law of the church, operated in parallel with secular law, and sometimes in conflict with it. Local customs and privileges meant that what was legal in one town might be forbidden in the next. This complexity meant that accusations and punishments could seem arbitrary, subject to the whims of local lords or the political needs of the moment. The concept of evidence in medieval courts would shock modern sensibilities. Torture was considered a legitimate means of investigation. If you were accused of a crime, particularly a serious one, you might be tortured until you confessed. The logic was that only the guilty would confess under torture, though of course, we now know that torture produces false confessions as often as true ones. Other forms of evidence included oaths, where the accused would swear their innocence, sometimes supported by oath helpers who would swear to their character. Trial by ordeal was another option, where the accused might be forced to carry hot iron or plunge their hand into boiling water, with their guilt or innocence determined by how their wounds healed. The physical spaces of medieval punishment are also worth considering. The dungeon, dark and underground, was a place of waiting and suffering before final punishment. The gallows or scaffold, raised up so all could see, was a stage for the final act. The town square, the center of community life, regularly hosted executions and punishments. These spaces shaped the experience of both victim and audience, creating environments where terror and spectacle merged. As we embark on this 3-hour journey through the darkest aspects of medieval justice, we must resist the temptation to see ourselves as entirely separate from this history. The mechanisms of fear, the use of violence to maintain power, the scapegoating of vulnerable groups, these patterns did not vanish with the Middle Ages. They evolved, sometimes becoming more subtle, sometimes erupting with renewed intensity. Understanding medieval punishment is not simply an exercise in historical curiosity. It is a way of understanding how societies use violence to define themselves, how fear functions as a tool of control, and how justice can be twisted to serve power rather than truth. The medieval period lasted roughly 1,000 years, and punishment practices varied considerably across time and geography. Early medieval punishments in the centuries following the fall of Rome often drew on Germanic tribal traditions, where compensation to victims or their families was common. By the High Middle Ages, from roughly the 11th to 13th centuries, more elaborate and theatrical punishments emerged, reflecting the growing power of centralized states and the church. The late Middle Ages, from the 14th century onward, saw some of the most extreme punishments, but also the first hints of critique and reform that would eventually lead to the end of these practices. The decline of medieval punishment, which we will explore in our final chapters, was not a simple story of progress. It involved changes in governance, shifts in religious thinking, the emergence of new philosophical ideas about human nature and rights, and practical considerations about the costs and effectiveness of public spectacle. The transition from medieval to early modern justice systems was gradual and uneven, with some brutal practices persisting into the 18th and even 19th centuries in some places. For the next 3 hours, you will hear descriptions that may disturb you. You will learn details about human cruelty that may be difficult to process. This is intentional. To understand medieval punishment is to understand it in its full horror, not sanitized or softened. We owe it to those who suffered these fates to tell their stories honestly. And we owe it to ourselves to understand what humans are capable of when fear and power combine. Prepare yourself for a journey into the past that is also a journey into the darker corners of human nature. We begin with one of the most infamous devices in history, a machine of death that has captured imaginations for centuries: the Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden stands as perhaps the most iconic symbol of medieval torture, a human-shaped sarcophagus lined with iron spikes, designed to impale its victim slowly as the door swings shut. Its image has been reproduced in countless horror films, museum exhibits, and history books. But the truth about the Iron Maiden is more complex and more disturbing than the simple legend suggests. Let us first describe the device itself, as it appears in historical reconstructions and later accounts. The Iron Maiden typically stood about 7 feet tall, roughly the height of a very tall person. It was constructed of iron or wood reinforced with iron, fashioned into a cabinet that could stand upright. The front opened on hinges like a door, or in some versions split down the middle into 2 halves. Inside, the surface was studded with iron spikes, some accounts describing them as 6 to 8 inches long, strategically positioned to pierce vital organs and major blood vessels. The victim would be placed inside the maiden while it stood open. Then, slowly or quickly, depending on the torturer's intent, the door would be closed. The spikes would enter the body, but here is where the design revealed its particularly sadistic nature. The spikes were supposedly positioned to avoid immediately killing the victim. They would pierce non-vital areas first, causing intense agony, but allowing the person to remain conscious and alive. Only when the door was fully closed would the spikes penetrate deeply enough to reach the heart, lungs, and other organs necessary for life. Some descriptions of the Iron Maiden include additional horrifying details. The face of the maiden was sometimes crafted to resemble the Virgin Mary, adding a layer of religious symbolism and blasphemy to the torture. The interior was supposedly designed so that the victim could see light through small holes in the eyes of the maiden's face, a cruel reminder of the world they were leaving. The device was sometimes placed on wheels, allowing the torturer to parade it around or position it wherever desired. Some accounts mention that the bottom of the maiden had holes to allow blood to drain out, suggesting it was used multiple times. But here is where our story takes a turn that reveals as much about human psychology as about medieval history. The Iron Maiden, as described above, almost certainly never existed in medieval times. The earliest confirmed example of such a device dates to the late 18th or early 19th century, hundreds of years after the medieval period ended. The famous Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, often cited as a medieval original, was actually constructed around 1800 from pieces of various medieval artifacts cobbled together. This revelation raises fascinating questions. If the Iron Maiden was not actually used in medieval times, why has it become such a powerful symbol of that era? Why do we believe so readily in its existence? The answers tell us something important about how we understand and remember history. The Iron Maiden was likely invented, or at least significantly embellished, during the 19th century, a time when there was enormous public interest in the medieval period. The Romantic movement in art and literature portrayed the Middle Ages as a time of both chivalry and darkness, knights and dungeons, beauty and horror. Entrepreneurs created fake torture museums, filled with dramatic reconstructions and exaggerated devices to satisfy public curiosity. The Iron Maiden was perfect for this purpose. It was visually striking, its mechanism was easy to understand, and it combined sexuality, religion, and violence in a way that Victorian audiences found simultaneously shocking and fascinating. But even if the specific device we call the Iron Maiden did not exist, this does not mean that medieval torture was less brutal than the legend suggests. If anything, the truth was worse. because medieval torture was not about exotic mechanisms, but about the systematic application of pain using simple, effective methods. The Iron Maiden is a myth, but it is a myth that points toward a real history of cruelty. Real medieval torture did include the use of spiked devices, though not in the form of the maiden. The Spanish donkey, for example, was a triangular wooden beam on which victims were forced to sit, with their weight concentrated on their groin and pelvic area. Weights might be attached to their feet to increase the pressure. Over hours or days, this would cause excruciating pain and permanent injury. The Judas cradle involved suspending a person over a pyramid-shaped seat and slowly lowering them onto it, with the point penetrating the anus, vagina, or other body openings. These devices were simple, required no complex mechanisms, and were devastatingly effective. The psychological function of torture devices like the Iron Maiden, whether real or imagined, was as important as their physical effects. The mere presence of these objects in a dungeon could break a person's will. Prisoners might confess to anything, true or false, simply to avoid being subjected to the device. This reveals an important truth about medieval torture. It was often about extracting confessions rather than punishing crimes. The torture chamber was an extension of the courtroom, a place where evidence was manufactured through pain. Let us consider what it would have been like to be led into a medieval torture chamber, whether or not an Iron Maiden was present. You would descend stone stairs, each step taking you further from the world of light and life. The air would grow colder and damper. You would smell decay, human waste, and the metallic scent of old blood. The torturer would likely describe each device in detail, explaining exactly what it would do to your body. This verbal torture was itself a technique designed to create terror that would be almost as effective as physical pain in breaking your resistance. The mythology of the Iron Maiden also reflects religious tensions of later periods. Many accounts of the device claim it was used by the Spanish Inquisition, though we now know this is false. The Protestant Reformation and Counter-Reformation created propaganda wars in which each side accused the other of extreme cruelty. The Iron Maiden, with its image of the Virgin Mary hiding death within, was perfect anti-Catholic propaganda, suggesting that the Church's holy symbols concealed murder and torture. The fact that this was not historically accurate did not prevent it from becoming part of the cultural memory of medieval and early modern religious violence. In modern times, the Iron Maiden has taken on new meanings. It has become a symbol in popular culture, lending its name to heavy metal bands and appearing in horror media. It represents a kind of pure, primal cruelty, stripped of the complex social and religious contexts that surrounded real medieval punishment. In a strange way, the mythical Iron Maiden has become more influential than any real medieval torture device, precisely because it is so visually striking and conceptually simple. But we must return to the real victims of medieval torture, people whose names we rarely know, whose suffering was recorded only in fragmentary legal documents or not recorded at all. They faced devices and techniques that, while perhaps less dramatic than the Iron Maiden, were no less agonizing. They were ordinary people, accused of crimes ranging from theft to heresy, subjected to torture because medieval law assumed that truth could be extracted through pain. The craftsmen who built torture devices are also worth considering. These were skilled metal workers and carpenters who applied their knowledge of materials and mechanics to the purpose of inflicting suffering. Did they think of themselves as servants of justice? Did they sleep well at night? Historical records rarely tell us about these individuals, but we know they existed, that in medieval workshops alongside craftsmen making horseshoes and plowshares, there were those making racks and iron spikes for human bodies. The Iron Maiden, whether real or mythical, also raises questions about the aesthetics of violence. Why fashion a torture device to resemble a human figure, specifically a female one? What does it mean to make an instrument of death beautiful, or at least visually elaborate? Medieval and early modern torture often had this aesthetic dimension. Executioners' swords were finely crafted and decorated. Scaffolds were built with architectural care. This suggests that torture and execution were not just about killing or causing pain. They were performances that needed to be visually impressive to fulfill their function of awe and terror. As we move away from the Iron Maiden and toward other medieval punishments, keep this lesson in mind. The most powerful historical myths are often those that contain psychological truth, even when they lack factual accuracy. The Iron Maiden never existed as described, but it represents something that did exist, a system of justice based on fear, a society that believed pain could purify and terror could prevent crime, and a fundamental disregard for the humanity of those accused of wrongdoing. In our next chapter, we will examine a punishment that definitely did exist and was widely used across medieval Europe. Breaking on the wheel, a method of execution so brutal that it became synonymous with the worst fate. If the Iron Maiden is a myth that has captured the imagination, the breaking wheel is a historical reality that demonstrates the true depths of medieval cruelty. This punishment was not confined to rare, sensational cases. It was a standard form of execution across much of Europe from the Middle Ages well into the 18th century, used for crimes considered particularly heinous: murder, treason, highway robbery, and sometimes arson or military desertion. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel or simply the wheel, was exactly what its name suggests: a large wooden wagon wheel, typically 6 to 8 feet in diameter, mounted horizontally on a pole or frame. But the wheel itself was only part of the apparatus. The true horror lay in how it was used. The condemned person would be brought to the place of execution, usually a raised platform in a public square, where crowds could gather to watch. The executioner and his assistants would begin by stripping the victim naked or nearly so, removing any dignity along with clothing. The person would then be stretched out on the ground or on a low wooden frame, with their limbs extended and tied to stakes or restraints. In some versions of this punishment, the victim was tied directly to the wheel itself before the breaking began, while in others, they were positioned on a separate frame first. Then the executioner would take up his primary tool, a heavy iron bar, sometimes a wagon spoke, sometimes a specially made implement weighing several pounds, and he would begin his terrible work. The goal was to systematically break every major bone in the victim's body, starting with the limbs and working inward. The executioner would swing the bar down onto the victim's arms and legs, shattering the bones. A skilled executioner would know exactly where and how hard to strike to break the bone cleanly or to shatter it into splinters, depending on what was desired. The number of blows could be specified in the sentence. A court might condemn someone to death by the wheel with 40 blows, or 60 or more. Each blow would produce a sharp crack as bone broke, a sound audible to the crowd, followed by the victim's screams. But here is what makes this punishment particularly horrific. The blows were deliberately calibrated to avoid killing the victim too quickly. The executioner would avoid striking the head, chest, or abdomen until the very end. The victim would remain conscious through much of the ordeal, experiencing each bone-shattering impact. After the limbs were broken, the executioner would often weave the victim's shattered arms and legs through the spokes of the wheel, a process that required bending the limbs in ways that intact bones would never allow. The victim's broken body was threaded through the wheel like some grotesque parody of weaving. Then the wheel would be hoisted up on its pole and left on display, with the victim still alive. This is where breaking on the wheel revealed its function as more than just execution. It was a spectacle of total domination, a demonstration that the law had power not just to kill, but to completely destroy a person's physical form. The victim, their body impossibly contorted, would be left on the wheel to die slowly from their injuries, from exposure, from thirst, or from shock. This could take hours or even days. Birds might peck at the exposed flesh. The weather, sun, or rain would further torment the dying person. And all the while, the wheel stood in a public place where everyone could see what happened to those who broke the law. However, there were variations in how this punishment was administered, variations that reveal the complex social codes governing medieval and early modern justice. If the condemned person was of high social status, or if they had shown remorse, or if there were mitigating circumstances, the executioner might be secretly instructed to deliver a coup de grâce, a killing blow, before the victim was placed on the wheel. This blow, often to the chest or neck, would end the person's life quickly, and the broken corpse would then be displayed on the wheel to fulfill the legal requirement of public punishment while sparing the victim the worst agony. The timing and method of this mercy stroke, when it was granted, were subject to negotiation and sometimes bribery. Families of the condemned might pay the executioner to ensure a quick death. The executioner's discretion in this matter gave him considerable power and also moral complexity. He was simultaneously an agent of brutal punishment and, in some cases, of mercy. Let us consider a specific historical example to make this concrete. In 1757, Robert François d'Amiens was executed in Paris for attempting to assassinate King Louis XV. Though this was after the medieval period proper, it demonstrates the continuation of medieval punishment methods. D'Amiens was subjected to an elaborate execution that included elements of breaking, though the wheel was not used. His ordeal lasted for hours and was witnessed by thousands. The public's reaction was mixed. Some were satisfied that justice had been done, but others were disturbed by the extreme cruelty. And this execution became a focal point for those arguing that such punishments should be abolished. The breaking wheel had particular associations with different types of crimes in different regions. In Germanic territories, it was often used for murderers. In France, it was associated with highway robbery. These regional variations meant that the same crime might result in very different punishments depending on where it occurred, adding to the seeming arbitrariness of medieval justice. The religious dimensions of the breaking wheel are also significant. In Christian theology, the body was the temple of the soul, and its integrity had meaning. To break someone's body so completely was to make a statement not just about their crime, but about their spiritual state. Some executions by wheel included prayers and religious rituals, with clergy present to offer the victim a chance at confession and absolution. This created a strange duality where the state was destroying the body while the church claimed to be saving the soul. The psychological impact on the executioner himself should not be overlooked. To repeatedly strike a human being, to feel the impact transmitted through the body or hands, to hear the crack of breaking bones and the victim's cries, this would affect anyone. Some executioners turned to alcohol to cope with their work. Others developed a cold professionalism. Still others, according to some accounts, seemed to take pleasure in their power over life and death. The executioner's role was socially necessary, but personally damaging, and this reflects the broader cost of a justice system based on spectacular cruelty. The crowd's behavior at wheel executions reveals much about medieval and early modern society. People would gather in large numbers, treating the event as entertainment. Food and drink were sold. Pickpockets worked the crowd, ironically committing crimes at an event meant to deter crime. Children were brought to watch, as public executions were considered educational, teaching the consequences of wrongdoing, but accounts also reveal that crowds could be unpredictable. If they felt the punishment was unjust, they might riot. If they felt sympathy for the victim, they might call for mercy. The crowd was not simply passive, it was a participant in the ritual of punishment. The technical skill required for breaking on the wheel should not be underestimated. An executioner needed to understand anatomy, to know where bones were close to the surface and how much force was required to break them without causing immediate death. This knowledge was often passed down within families of executioners, creating dynasties of professional death dealers. The tools of the trade, the bars and wheels and restraints, were maintained with care, treated as the important implements they were. The decline of the breaking wheel as a punishment method began in the 18th century during the Enlightenment, when philosophers and legal reformers began to argue that justice should not involve torture and that punishment should be swift and certain rather than prolonged and theatrical. The arguments against the wheel were both practical and moral. Practical because such punishments were expensive and time-consuming to administer, requiring skilled executioners and elaborate preparations. Moral because Enlightenment thinkers were developing new ideas about human dignity and the proper role of government. But the breaking wheel did not disappear overnight. In some parts of Europe, it continued to be used into the 19th century, long after other regions had abolished it. This uneven progress toward less cruel punishments reminds us that historical change is rarely uniform or complete. When we think about the breaking wheel today, we might be tempted to see it simply as evidence of medieval barbarism, proof that we have progressed beyond such savagery. But this comfortable interpretation misses something important. The breaking wheel worked within a logical system. It deterred crime through fear. It demonstrated state power. It provided a sense of justice and closure to victims and their families. The fact that we find it abhorrent does not mean that the people who used it were simply evil or ignorant. They were operating within a different framework of values, where social order was paramount and individual suffering was acceptable in service of that order. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of punishments like the breaking wheel. They were not aberrations or the work of sadistic individuals. They were institutions, regularized and legalized, supported by laws and courts and churches. Normal people who loved their families and went to church and considered themselves moral, participated in and supported these practices. Understanding this forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about what humans are capable of when cultural norms and institutional structures support cruelty. As we leave the breaking wheel behind and move to our next topic, carry with you this image: a large wooden wheel raised high on a pole, visible from far across the town. Woven through its spokes, a human body, broken and twisted. And below, people going about their daily business, buying bread and cloth, discussing the weather. So accustomed to the presence of this horror that they barely notice it. This was the reality of medieval punishment, not hidden in dark dungeons, but displayed in the brightest public spaces, normalized to the point of invisibility. Next, we turn to another device of torture that was widespread and devastatingly effective: the rack, an instrument that turned the human body against itself through relentless stretching. The rack represents torture in perhaps its purest form: simple, efficient, and absolutely devastating to the human body. Unlike the theatrical brutality of the breaking wheel or the mythical complexity of the Iron Maiden, the rack required no complicated mechanisms and no special skill to operate. It simply exploited the fundamental structure of human anatomy, turning our joints and connective tissues into sources of unbearable agony. The basic design of the rack was deceptively simple. Picture a rectangular wooden frame, usually about 6 to 7 feet long and 3 feet wide, constructed of heavy timber. At each end of the frame were rollers, wooden cylinders mounted on axles that could be turned using handles or levers. Attached to these rollers were ropes or chains. The victim would be laid on their back on the frame, and their wrists would be tied to the ropes at one end, while their ankles were secured to the ropes at the other end. Then the stretching would begin. The torturer would turn the rollers, gradually pulling the ropes tighter. As the ropes tightened, they would pull the victim's arms and legs in opposite directions. At first, this would simply feel uncomfortable, like an extreme stretch. But as the tension increased, the victim's body would begin to elongate. Their spine would straighten forcibly. Their limbs would be pulled taut. And then the pain would begin in earnest. The human body is not designed to be stretched in this way. Our joints, those magnificent pieces of biological engineering that allow us to move with such flexibility, are held together by ligaments and surrounded by cartilage. These structures can handle the normal range of motion, but they have limits. The rack exceeded those limits systematically and deliberately. As the stretching continued, the victim would first feel intense pressure in their major joints: shoulders, hips, knees, elbows. The ligaments would strain against the increasing force. The cartilage would compress unevenly. At a certain point, the soft tissues would begin to tear. Ligaments would partially separate from bones. Cartilage would start to disintegrate, and the pain from these injuries was extraordinary. But the torture would not stop there. The rollers would continue to turn. The victim's body would stretch further. Their spine would elongate as the vertebrae separated slightly, compressing the discs between them and pinching nerves. Their ribcage would expand beyond its normal capacity, making it difficult to breathe. Their arms and legs would extend until the joints began to dislocate. The sound of dislocation was reportedly distinctive, a wet, popping sound as the ball of the joint separated from its socket. Shoulders would dislocate first, typically, as they are the most mobile joints and therefore the most vulnerable to this kind of stress. Then hips. The victim would feel each dislocation as an explosion of pain radiating from the joint throughout their entire body. And still, the stretching could continue. In extreme cases, when the torture went to its furthest extent, the continued tension could actually pull limbs from their sockets completely, though this was rare as it would likely kill the victim from shock, defeating the purpose if the goal was to extract information. More commonly, the torture would be stopped before this point, leaving the victim with dislocated joints, torn ligaments, damaged cartilage, and nerve injuries that might never fully heal. But here is what made the rack particularly effective as a tool of torture. It could be stopped at any point, and the victim would still be in extreme pain. This meant it could be used not just for punishment, but for interrogation. The torturer could stretch the victim to a certain level of pain, then stop and ask questions. If the answers were unsatisfactory, the stretching would resume. If the victim confessed or provided information, the torture might be ended, though the victim would still face the consequences of their damaged body. The psychological aspects of the rack were as brutal as the physical ones. Unlike the sudden violence of other punishments, the rack was gradual and progressive. The victim could feel each increment of increased pain. They knew it would get worse. They could anticipate the next turn of the rollers. This created a particular kind of dread that was, in its own way, a form of torture separate from the physical pain. Furthermore, the rack left its victims alive, but often permanently disabled. Someone who had been severely racked might never regain full use of their limbs. Their damaged joints would ache for the rest of their lives. Their spine might never straighten properly again. This created living examples of what happened to those who crossed the authorities, walking testimonies to the power of the state and the consequences of resistance. The rack was used across Europe, though it was particularly associated with England, where it featured prominently in the Tower of London and was employed by various monarchs to extract confessions from accused traitors, religious dissenters, and political enemies. Unlike the breaking wheel, which was primarily used for execution and public spectacle, the rack was usually employed in private, in dungeon torture chambers, where the privacy enhanced its effectiveness as a tool for extracting information. One of the most famous victims of the rack was Guy Fawkes, who in 1605 was involved in the Gunpowder Plot to blow up the English Parliament and King James I. After his capture, Fawkes was taken to the Tower of London and subjected to torture on the rack. Historical accounts note that his signature on his confession, written after he was racked, was barely recognizable compared to his signature before torture, his handwriting reduced to a shaky scrawl by the damage to his arms and hands. Fawkes would eventually be executed by hanging, drawing, and quartering, but his experience on the rack demonstrates how torture was used to gather intelligence about co-conspirators and the details of plots. The question of whether the rack was effective in extracting true information is complex. Certainly, people confessed under torture. They named names, described plots, admitted to crimes, but we now know that torture is an unreliable method for gathering accurate information. People in extreme pain will say anything to make it stop, true or false. They will confess to crimes they did not commit. They will implicate innocent people. The information extracted on the rack might be genuine intelligence, or it might be complete fabrication, and the torturers often had no reliable way to distinguish between the two. This raises troubling questions about the real purpose of the rack. If it was not reliable for gathering information, why was it used so extensively? The answer seems to be that its purposes went beyond mere information gathering. It demonstrated power. It satisfied public demands for justice or revenge. It reinforced hierarchies by showing what happened to those who challenged authority. It fulfilled religious purposes, as extracting a confession was seen as potentially saving a soul, and it served the career interests of torturers and interrogators who gained status and income from their work. The legal framework surrounding the use of the rack varied across different jurisdictions. In some places, torture had to be authorized by specific legal procedures. There might be limits on who could be tortured, with nobility sometimes exempt. There might be requirements about the types of crimes that justified torture, but these legal restrictions were often honored more in the breach than the observance. When authorities wanted to use the rack, they generally found a way to justify it legally. The church's relationship with torture was complicated. On one hand, canon law initially forbade clergy from participating directly in torture or execution, based on the principle that priests should not shed blood. On the other hand, the church authorized and encouraged the use of torture by secular authorities in cases of heresy, and church courts could hand convicted heretics over to secular powers for punishment, while maintaining the legal fiction that the church itself was not involved in violence. This hypocrisy was apparent to contemporary observers and remains a dark stain on the history of Christianity. The physical location of the rack, typically in underground torture chambers, contributed to its psychological impact. Victims would be taken down into darkness, into spaces deliberately designed to be disorienting and frightening. The stone walls would echo with screams. The air would be cold and damp. Other torture devices would be visible, creating a landscape of potential pain. The torturer might show the victim the rack before using it, describing in detail what would happen, giving the victim time to imagine their suffering. This anticipatory terror was itself a form of torture. The mechanics of operating the rack required at least two people, one to turn the rollers and one to monitor the victim and ask questions. But larger torture sessions might involve more participants. Additional muscle to turn the rollers if more force was needed, a clerk to record confessions, perhaps a priest to encourage confession, and authorities to observe and make decisions about how far the torture should go. This bureaucratization of torture, this transformation of cruelty into a procedural matter involving multiple officials, reveals how institutions can normalize horror. There were variations on the basic rack design. Some versions included ways to elevate the victim's body off the frame, suspending them entirely by their stretched limbs. Others incorporated additional elements like straps around the torso that could be tightened to compress the chest while the limbs were being stretched. Still others were angled rather than horizontal, positioning the victim in the different ways to vary the distribution of stress on the body. These variations suggest that the technology of torture was not static, but evolved, with torturers learning from experience and sharing techniques. The decline of the rack as an official tool of justice began in the 17th and 18th centuries, as part of broader reforms in legal procedures and attitudes toward torture. England officially abandoned judicial torture, including use of the rack, in the 17th century, though unofficial torture continued in various forms. Other European nations followed at different paces, with the process of reform extending over more than a century. But even as the rack disappeared from official legal use, it persisted in the popular imagination and found new applications. The term racking pain entered the language as a description of intense suffering. The image of the rack appeared in Gothic literature and later in horror fiction, becoming a symbol of medieval cruelty. And the basic principle of the rack, using suspension and stress positions to create pain without visible marks, reappeared in 20th and 21st century torture practices, demonstrating that the underlying logic of certain forms of torture transcends specific historical periods. When we think about the rack today, we should remember that it was not an exotic rarity. It was a standard tool found in castles and prisons across Europe, used routinely in the administration of justice. People walked past the rooms that contained racks, knowing what happened there, accepting it as part of how their society functioned. The normalization of such cruelty, its integration into the everyday operations of law and order, is perhaps more disturbing than the device itself. As we move forward in our exploration of medieval punishments, we shift from the torture chamber to the public square, from devices that extracted information to methods that extracted life itself in the most horrifying ways imaginable. Our next chapter examines one of the most common forms of execution in medieval and early modern Europe: burning at the stake, the fate reserved for heretics, witches, and those accused of crimes against religion itself. Fire has held a special place in human consciousness since our ancestors first learned to control it. It provides warmth and light. It transforms raw food into cooked meals. It drives away darkness and danger. But fire also destroys. It consumes. It reduces solid matter to ash. And it causes pain unlike almost any other source. To burn at the stake was to experience one of the most agonizing deaths imaginable. A death that carried profound religious and symbolic meaning in the Christian culture of medieval Europe. Burning as a method of execution has ancient roots, predating the Middle Ages by centuries. But it was during the medieval period that burning at the stake became particularly associated with certain types of crimes, especially heresy and witchcraft. The theological logic behind this choice of punishment was significant. Fire was seen as purifying. It could cleanse the body of sin, even as it destroyed the flesh. Moreover, burning left no intact body to bury, which had implications for beliefs about resurrection. To burn someone was to attack not just their present life, but potentially their eternal soul. Let us describe the process of execution by burning at the stake in its typical medieval form. The condemned person would be brought to a place of public execution, often the town square or an open area where large crowds could gather. A tall wooden stake would be set into the ground, rising 8 to 12 feet high. Around the base of the stake, wood would be piled, logs, branches, kindling, arranged to burn efficiently and produce intense heat. The condemned person would be led or carried to the stake. Their clothing might be removed or replaced with a simple shift, both to humiliate and to ensure the flames would reach their flesh quickly. They would be tied or chained to the stake, usually at the waist and sometimes at the ankles and neck as well, secured tightly enough that they could not escape but positioned, so that they would remain upright as the flames rose. In some cases, particularly when the condemned person had shown repentance, or when authorities wished to show a degree of mercy, a bag of gunpowder might be hung around the person's neck. This would explode when the flames reached it, causing instant death and sparing the victim the worst agony of burning. Alternatively, the executioner might strangle the person before the fire was lit, using a rope or garrote to end their life quickly, while still fulfilling the letter of the sentence that they be burned. But when no mercy was shown, the full horror of burning at the stake would unfold. The executioner would light the kindling at multiple points around the perimeter of the woodpile. The flames would catch and begin to spread. At first, the heat would be uncomfortable, but not immediately painful. The condemned person would feel warmth, then growing heat. But as the flames grew and began to climb toward them, the experience would rapidly become unbearable. Human skin begins to burn at relatively low temperatures. Even before flames directly touch the body, the radiant heat from the fire would start to cause burns. The skin of the legs and lower body would redden, then blister. The hair would singe and burn. The smoke would grow thick, making it hard to breathe. And here was one of the cruelties of this method. The smoke would often suffocate the victim before the flames fully consumed them, but not quickly enough to prevent prolonged suffering. As the flames reached the body, the pain would be excruciating. Fire activates pain receptors throughout the body intensely and continuously. The burning of flesh produces a smell that witnesses consistently described as horrific and unforgettable. The victim would scream, these screams becoming weaker as smoke inhalation damaged the lungs and throat. In cases where the fire was particularly intense, the body might become engulfed in flames within minutes, but more commonly the process took longer, with the fire burning unevenly, consuming the lower body while the victim remained conscious. The physical process of a human body burning is clinical in its horror. Flesh burns and chars, fat liquefies and feeds the flames, creating a particularly intense heat. Muscles contract from the heat, causing the body to move and contort, which witnesses sometimes interpreted as the victim attempting to escape, or as signs of life continuing long past what was likely. Bones crack from heat stress. Eventually, as the fire continues, the body is reduced to charred remains and ash. But the execution by burning was not simply about the physical act. It was a ceremony laden with meaning. For the church and state, it demonstrated power and righteousness. For the crowd, it was spectacle, entertainment, and a lesson. The condemned person would often be given opportunity to confess and repent before the fire was lit. A priest might offer last rites. These religious observances created a strange duality. The same institution that had condemned the person to death was offering them salvation for their soul, even as their body was about to be destroyed. The crimes that led to burning at the stake reveal much about medieval society's deepest fears and obsessions. Heresy, the crime of holding religious beliefs contrary to church doctrine, was the most common reason for burning. The medieval church viewed heresy as perhaps the worst possible crime because it threatened not just social order, but the salvation of souls. A heretic was seen as a spiritual disease that could spread and contaminate others. Burning was thought to prevent this contagion. Witchcraft accusations, which reached their peak in the early modern period rather than the medieval period proper, also frequently resulted in burning at the stake, particularly in continental Europe. The logic was similar to that for heresy. Witches were thought to have made pacts with the devil, putting their immortal souls at risk and threatening the spiritual well-being of the community. Burning purified the community of this evil presence. Women were disproportionately the victims of burning for witchcraft, reflecting the deeply misogynistic nature of witch hunts. Older women, women who lived alone, women who had knowledge of herbs and healing, women who were simply unpopular or who had property that others wanted, all could find themselves accused of witchcraft. The trial and execution process for accused witches was frequently a sham, with torture used to extract confessions and with legal procedures that made proving innocence nearly impossible. One of the most famous victims of burning at the stake was Joan of Arc, the French military leader who claimed divine guidance. In 1431, at the age of 19, Joan was burned in the marketplace of Rouen after being convicted of charges including heresy and wearing men's clothing. Her execution was politically motivated, carried out by English and Burgundian forces and their clerical allies who wanted to discredit the French cause she had championed. Accounts of her death describe her calling out to Jesus repeatedly as the flames rose. Her martyrdom would later be recognized by the Church, and she was canonized as a saint in 1920, nearly 5 centuries after her execution. The geography of burning varied across Europe. In England, burning was reserved particularly for women convicted of petty treason, which included the murder of a husband. Men convicted of similar crimes would be hanged. This gendered difference in execution methods reflected beliefs about women's nature and the supposed special horror of a woman betraying her husband. In Scotland, burning was used for both men and women convicted of heresy or witchcraft well into the 18th century, making Scotland one of the last places in Western Europe to abandon this practice. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, is often associated with burning at the stake, and indeed it did use this method of execution. However, the actual practice was more complex than popular legend suggests. The Inquisition distinguished between different types of heretics, and most convicted heretics faced penalties short of execution: imprisonment, penance, confiscation of property. Those who were sentenced to death would be handed over to secular authorities for execution, allowing the Church to maintain the fiction that it did not directly kill anyone. The execution ceremony, called an auto da fe, was an elaborate public ritual that could last for hours or even days, involving processions, readings of charges, and public penances before any executions took place. The psychological experience of being burned at the stake, to the extent we can reconstruct it from historical accounts, included elements beyond just physical pain. There was the terror of anticipation, often preceded by imprisonment and torture. There was the humiliation of public exposure. There was the profound isolation of standing bound while surrounded by thousands who had come to watch you die. Some victims found strength in religious faith, believing they were martyrs who would be rewarded in heaven. Others broke completely, screaming and begging for mercy that would not come. The crowd's behavior at burnings varied widely. In some cases, crowds were hostile to the victim, jeering and celebrating the execution as righteous justice. In other cases, particularly when the victim was well-liked or when the charges seemed dubious, the crowd might be sympathetic or even angry at the authorities. There are accounts of crowds attempting to rush forward to add more fuel to make the fire burn faster, which might be seen as cruelty or as a mercy to hasten death. There are also accounts of riots breaking out when crowds felt an execution was unjust. The executioner's role in burning at the stake was somewhat different from their role in other forms of execution. They were responsible for preparing the stake and arranging the wood to burn efficiently. They might be ordered to show mercy by strangling the victim first, or by ensuring the fire burned hot enough to kill quickly. Or they might be instructed to arrange the wood so the fire burned slowly, prolonging agony. This discretion gave executioners power and also moral burden. The economic aspects of burnings should not be overlooked. Executions were expensive public events. The wood had to be gathered or purchased. The stake had to be erected. Guards and officials had to be paid. In some cases, the condemned person or their family was required to pay for the costs of their own execution, adding financial ruin to the other catastrophes they faced. This turned execution into a kind of grim business transaction. The decline of burning at the stake as a legal punishment began in the 17th century and accelerated in the 18th, as part of the broader Enlightenment critique of torture and cruel punishments. Reformers argued that burning was barbaric and that it reflected poorly on civilized nations. The last legal burning in England occurred in 1789. Other European nations abandoned the practice around the same time, though illegal burnings, particularly in the context of mob violence and lynching, continued much later. But even as official use of burning at the stake ended in Europe, it persisted in other contexts and places. Colonial powers sometimes used burning in their overseas territories. Mob violence, particularly racially motivated violence in the United States, used burning well into the 20th century. The image and fear of burning at the stake remain powerful in cultural memory, representing religious extremism and the danger of allowing ideology to override humanity. When we contemplate burning at the stake today, we should remember that it was not only about inflicting death, but about making statements. It proclaimed the power of orthodoxy over dissent. It warned others not to challenge established order. It satisfied demands for vengeance. It performed ideas about purity and pollution. The fire consumed not just a body, but the social identity of the person, reducing them to ash that could be scattered and forgotten, or displayed as a warning. As we move from burning at the stake to our next punishment, we shift from fire to metal, from the purification of flames to the grotesque ingenuity of a device designed to combine torture with execution in a form that is almost unimaginable in its cruelty: the brazen bull. Among all the instruments of torture and execution we have examined so far, the brazen bull stands out for its particularly nightmarish quality. This device combined the lethality of burning with a form of sensory manipulation that transformed the victim's screams into entertainment for the audience. Whether it truly existed as described, or whether it has been embellished over centuries, the brazen bull represents a pinnacle of calculated cruelty in the historical imagination. The brazen bull, also known as the bronze bull or the bull of Phalaris, was allegedly created in ancient Greece, specifically in the city of Akragas in Sicily during the 6th century BCE, making it technically pre-medieval. However, accounts of the device persisted throughout the medieval period, and some historians believe versions of it may have been constructed or reconstructed during medieval times. Regardless of its exact historical provenance, the brazen bull became part of the medieval consciousness of extreme punishment and deserves examination in that context. According to ancient accounts, particularly those of the Greek historians Lucian and Diodorus Siculus, the brazen bull was commissioned by Phalaris, the tyrant of Akragas. The device was crafted by a bronze worker named Perilos, who designed it as a new method of execution that would serve both functional and artistic purposes. Perilos allegedly demonstrated the bull to Phalaris, who was so impressed, or perhaps so disturbed, that he ordered Perilos himself to be the first victim, a grimly ironic fate for the inventor of such horror. The device itself was a large hollow statue of a bull, cast in bronze and large enough to contain a human being. The bull was made to look realistic, with detailed features: horns, hooves, eyes, and an open mouth. The statue was completely hollow inside, with a door in the side that could be opened to place a victim inside and then sealed shut. At the base of the bull, or sometimes described as underneath it, was a chamber where a fire could be built. The method of execution was horrific in its simplicity. The condemned person would be placed inside the bronze bull through the side door, which would then be locked or welded shut. A fire would be lit beneath the bull. As the bronze heated from the flames, the interior of the bull would become increasingly hot, eventually reaching temperatures sufficient to cook the person inside alive. But here is where the brazen bull revealed its most sadistic aspect. The device was engineered with acoustic features. According to the ancient accounts, complex tubes and stops were installed in the bull's head, connecting to its open mouth. When the victim inside screamed from the heat and pain, these sounds would travel through the tubes and be transformed. The victim's screams would emerge from the bull's mouth, sounding like the bellowing of an actual bull. This converted human agony into animal sounds, dehumanizing the victim while providing a kind of horrific entertainment for observers. Some accounts add further grotesque details. The heat was supposedly calibrated to kill slowly, taking hours rather than minutes, maximizing the victim's suffering. The bronze would conduct heat efficiently but gradually, first making the interior uncomfortably warm, then painfully hot, then unbearably so, giving the victim time to fully experience each stage of their immolation. As the person inside moved and thrashed in their agony, the bronze bull would reportedly rock slightly, creating the illusion that the bull itself was moving, alive. Another reported feature was that after the execution, once the bull had cooled and the victim's body was removed, the bones would supposedly be bleached white from the intense heat and could be fashioned into bracelets or other jewelry, which would be distributed as grim souvenirs. Whether this detail is true or a later embellishment is unclear, but it suggests the depth of dehumanization involved in such executions. The question of whether the brazen bull actually existed, either in ancient times or in medieval reconstructions, is debated among historians. No confirmed archaeological examples have been found. The earliest written accounts of the device come from sources writing centuries after it supposedly existed. This has led some scholars to suggest that the brazen bull is a legend, a story told to illustrate extreme cruelty rather than a device that was actually built and used. However, other scholars point out that the technical requirements for building a brazen bull were well within the capabilities of ancient and medieval bronze workers. Large bronze statues were regularly created. The acoustic manipulation would have required skill, but was possible with the understanding of acoustics available at the time. And there are passing references to bull-shaped execution devices in various historical sources, though these are frustratingly vague and could refer to different things. Whether or not the brazen bull existed as a physical device, its power as a symbol is undeniable. It represents several important themes in the history of punishment. First, it demonstrates the aesthetic dimension of torture and execution. The device was not just functional, but beautiful, a work of art that happened to kill people. This combination of beauty and horror is deeply disturbing, forcing us to confront the fact that human creativity can be directed toward creating suffering as easily as toward creating joy. Second, the brazen bull's acoustic features highlight the role of spectacle in punishment. The transformation of screams into animal sounds served multiple purposes. It provided entertainment, turning execution into a kind of performance with sound effects. It dehumanized the victim, making their suffering easier for the audience to accept by making them seem less than human. And it demonstrated the complete control the authorities had over the victim, controlling not just their life and death, but even the sounds they could make. Third, the stories surrounding the brazen bull emphasize the irony and cruelty of fate. Perilos, the inventor, allegedly becoming the first victim of his own creation, serves as a cautionary tale about the unpredictability of power and the danger of creating tools of oppression. Phalaris himself, the tyrant who supposedly commissioned the bull, was later overthrown and, according to some accounts, executed in his own bronze bull, demonstrating that those who live by cruelty may die by it. If the brazen bull did exist in medieval times, it would likely have been used in ways consistent with other medieval punishments. It would have been reserved for particularly serious crimes, or for enemies of whoever held power. Its use would have been public, with crowds gathering to witness the execution. The victim might have been given opportunity to confess or repent before being placed inside. And the execution would have carried symbolic meaning, perhaps with the bull representing the strength and power of the ruler, consuming those who opposed them. The sensory experience of being executed in a brazen bull, if it occurred, would have been uniquely horrible. The victim would be in complete darkness once the door was sealed. The space would be cramped, preventing movement. As the heat built, the victim would first sweat profusely. Then the moisture in the air would feel scalding. Their skin would burn from contact with the hot bronze. The air itself would become too hot to breathe safely, searing their lungs. Consciousness might be lost from heat stroke before death, offering some mercy, but not before extended agony. The psychological torture would be as bad as the physical. Being sealed inside a metal container, unable to see what was happening, feeling the heat slowly increase, knowing that death was certain, but not knowing exactly when it would come, all of this would create intense panic and despair. The victim would be completely helpless, unable to fight or flee, or even communicate effectively with those outside. This absolute powerlessness is a recurring theme in the worst forms of torture and execution. Comparing the brazen bull to other methods of execution by burning reveals important differences. Burning at the stake, horrific as it was, at least left the victim in the open air where they could see and be seen, where smoke might bring relatively quicker suffocation. The brazen bull isolated the victim, sealing them away from any human contact or comfort, turning their death into a solitary horror. This isolation represents another form of cruelty, denying the victim any companionship or witness to their suffering beyond those who heard only the transformed sounds of their agony. The legacy of the brazen bull in popular culture has been significant. It appears in literature, art, and more recently in films and video games as a symbol of ultimate cruelty. Often it is associated with ancient civilizations or with particularly evil characters, representing the depths of human depravity. This cultural presence keeps the idea of the brazen bull alive, even if the device itself never existed or was used only rarely. From a technological perspective, the brazen bull represents the application of craftsmanship and engineering skill to the purpose of inflicting suffering. This raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between technological progress and morality. Throughout history, humans have been remarkably creative in developing new ways to hurt each other, often applying the same ingenuity to weapons and torture devices that we apply to tools and art. The brazen bull, whether real or legendary, stands as a reminder that technical skill is morally neutral, its value determined entirely by the purposes to which it is put. The medieval fascination with devices like the brazen bull also reflects broader cultural concerns. Medieval people were deeply interested in the classical past, seeing themselves as inheritors of Greek and Roman civilization. Stories of ancient cruelties served multiple purposes. They could be used as moral lessons about the dangers of tyranny. They could entertain through their shock value, and they could make contemporary practices seem less cruel by comparison. If the ancients had used bronze bulls to execute people, perhaps contemporary methods were not so bad after all. The question of pain and historical punishment deserves deeper consideration here. Modern neuroscience has helped us understand how pain works in the brain, how it can be overwhelming and all-consuming, how it affects memory and personality. Medieval people did not have this scientific understanding, but they understood pain experientially. They knew what it felt like. The deliberate infliction of maximum pain, as represented by devices like the brazen bull, suggests a worldview in which causing suffering was not just acceptable, but desirable, at least when directed at certain categories of people deemed deserving of such treatment. This brings us to the uncomfortable recognition that the line between civilization and barbarity is thinner than we might like to believe. The same societies that produced great art, literature, and philosophy also produced instruments of torture. The same people who loved their families and prayed to their gods also watched executions for entertainment. The brazen bull, whether it existed or not, forces us to confront this duality in human nature. As we conclude our examination of the brazen bull and prepare to move to our next topic, we should reflect on the power of legends and stories in shaping how we understand history. Even if the brazen bull is largely or entirely mythical, it has influenced how we think about ancient and medieval punishment, becoming in some ways more real than the reality it may or may not represent. This is the strange power of horror stories. They can be more influential than facts, shaping consciousness and culture across centuries. Our next chapter takes us to one of the most famous punishments in history, a method of execution so elaborate and so brutal that its name has become synonymous with the worst fate imaginable: drawing and quartering, the traitor's end. If you're still with us after 90 minutes of medieval horror, you're clearly fascinated by history's darkest secrets. Subscribe to The Deep Unknown for more deep dives into the mysteries they don't teach in school. New 3-hour documentaries every week. Drawing and quartering represents perhaps the apex of medieval execution practices in terms of elaborate brutality. Reserved primarily for men convicted of high treason in England, this punishment was not simply about ending a life, but about utterly destroying a person's body in the most public and symbolic way possible. To be sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered was to face a death of multiple stages, each more horrific than the last, designed to serve as the ultimate deterrent to anyone who might consider betraying their king. The full name of this punishment provides some insight into its components: hanged, drawn, and quartered, though the actual sequence and specifics varied over the centuries it was used. The punishment evolved from simpler forms of execution for treason into the elaborate ritual that became standard in the 13th through 18th centuries. To understand drawing and quartering fully, we must examine each stage of this multi-part execution. The ordeal would typically begin with the condemned person being dragged through the streets to the place of execution. The term drawn in drawn and quartered may refer to this initial stage, where the prisoner would be fastened to a wooden hurdle, essentially a panel dragged behind a horse. The prisoner would lie on the hurdle, sometimes tied, sometimes simply holding on, as the horse pulled them through the streets of the city or town. This journey could be quite long, depending on where the prisoner was held and where the execution was to take place. The purpose of this public dragging was multifold. It humiliated the prisoner, displaying them in a vulnerable and undignified position. It advertised the upcoming execution, gathering crowds who would follow the procession to the execution site. It served as a ceremonial separation, taking the prisoner from the world of the living on a one-way journey to death. And it often inflicted physical harm. The prisoner might be injured from being dragged over rough ground, arriving at the execution site already bloodied and battered. Once at the execution site, typically a public square or specifically designated execution ground like Tyburn in London, the main phases of the execution would begin. The prisoner would be stripped naked or nearly so, further humiliating them and ensuring that the subsequent tortures would be maximally painful and visible. The first major stage was hanging, but not hanging as we typically think of it today. The condemned person would be hanged from a gallows, but intentionally not to the point of death. The goal was to strangle them partially, bringing them to the edge of death without completing the act. The body would be cut down while they were still conscious, or at least while their heart was still beating. This required skill and timing on the part of the executioner, who had to judge the precise moment to cut the rope. The next stage was the most grotesque: emasculation and disembowelment. While the victim was still alive or very recently cut down from the hanging, the executioner would castrate them, cutting away the genitals. Then the executioner would make an incision in the abdomen and begin to remove the internal organs. The intestines would be pulled out, along with other organs. These organs might be burned in a fire that had been prepared nearby, forcing the victim to watch their own insides being destroyed, assuming they were still conscious. The precise medical reality of how much of this process a person could survive while conscious is disputed. Modern medical knowledge suggests that the trauma and blood loss would typically cause unconsciousness fairly quickly, though not instantly. However, the intention and design of the punishment was clear: to inflict maximum suffering and to demonstrate complete domination over the victim's body. Finally came the quartering itself. The victim's body, whether they were dead by this point or not, would be beheaded. Then the body would be divided into 4 quarters. Typically, this meant cutting the torso in half and separating the legs, though the exact method of division varied. These 5 pieces, the 4 quarters plus the head, would then be displayed in prominent public locations as a warning to others. The head might be placed on a spike on London Bridge or another highly visible location. The quarters might be sent to different cities where the traitor had supporters or where rebellion had occurred, serving as gruesome reminders of the consequences of treason. The symbolic significance of drawing and quartering was profound. Treason was considered the ultimate crime in medieval and early modern England, a betrayal not just of the king, but of God, as the king was understood to rule by divine right. The elaborate destruction of the traitor's body symbolized the complete rejection of the person from human society and, potentially, from salvation itself. By scattering the quarters of the body, the execution made proper burial impossible and symbolically prevented resurrection, at least in a physical sense. One of the most famous victims of drawing and quartering was William Wallace, the Scottish knight who fought against English rule in the late 13th century. In 1305, Wallace was captured and taken to London, where he was tried for treason, though he argued he could not be a traitor to a king he had never sworn allegiance to. He was convicted nonetheless and sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. According to chroniclers, Wallace maintained his defiance throughout the execution, refusing to show fear or ask for mercy. His quarters were displayed in 4 different Scottish towns, while his head was placed on London Bridge. Wallace's execution, far from ending Scottish resistance, made him a martyr and a symbol of national identity that persists to this day. The Gunpowder Plot conspirators, including Guy Fawkes, whom we mentioned earlier, also faced drawing and quartering. In 1606, those involved in the plot to blow up Parliament were executed in this manner. Fawkes, weakened by torture on the rack, allegedly managed to jump from the gallows before he could be fully hanged, breaking his neck and dying before the most painful stages of the execution could be carried out. Whether this was intentional on his part, a final act of defiance and control over his own death, or simply an accident, has been debated by historians. The legal framework for drawing and quartering was specific and evolved over time. Initially, it was reserved for men convicted of high treason. Women convicted of the same crimes typically faced burning at the stake instead, a gendered distinction in execution methods that reflected contemporary beliefs about appropriate forms of death for different sexes. The definition of high treason itself was sometimes expanded for political purposes, allowing monarchs to use this ultimate punishment against a wider range of enemies. The executioner's role in drawing and quartering required considerable skill and physical strength. Cutting a human body into quarters is not an easy task, requiring sharp tools and knowledge of anatomy. The executioner had to work quickly, as the entire process was public spectacle, and any fumbling or delay would be seen as incompetence. At the same time, certain stages like the hanging required precise judgment to bring the victim close to death without killing them outright. Executioners who performed drawing and quartering well could command high fees and were in demand, while those who botched executions might face public anger or even physical attack from the crowd. The audience for drawing and quartering was typically very large. These executions were major public events, sometimes announced days in advance. People would travel considerable distances to witness them. The crowd would be diverse, including everyone from the nobility, who might watch from special viewing areas, to common people who jostled for position to get a good view. Street vendors would sell food and drink. Pickpockets would work the crowd. The atmosphere was often festival-like, a strange combination of entertainment and moral lesson. But crowd reactions were not always simply celebratory or approving. Witnesses describe instances where the brutality of the execution horrified even hardened observers. Some spectators fainted, others vomited, some turned away, unable to watch. And in some cases, particularly when the victim was seen as sympathetic, or when the charges seemed politically motivated, the crowd's mood could turn hostile toward the authorities rather than the condemned. Public executions always carried the risk that they would backfire, generating sympathy for the victim rather than fear of the law. The physical locations where drawing and quartering took place became imbued with dark significance. Tyburn, the primary execution site in London for centuries, was associated with death and suffering to such a degree that nearby residents complained about the effect on property values and the character of the neighborhood. The ground at execution sites was believed by some to be cursed or to have special properties. Pieces of the execution apparatus, like the rope from the gallows, were sometimes taken as macabre souvenirs or believed to have magical properties. The timing of drawing and quartering executions was also significant. They might be scheduled for market days when crowds would already be gathered, maximizing the audience. They might be timed to follow religious holidays or significant dates in the calendar, adding layers of symbolism. The execution might take place in the morning to ensure there was plenty of daylight for the crowd to see everything clearly, or sometimes at other times for specific symbolic reasons. The preservation and display of the body parts after quartering presented logistical challenges. The head and quarters had to be preserved enough to remain recognizable for display, which might last weeks or months. Various methods were used. The pieces might be parboiled to partially preserve them, or treated with tar or other preservatives. They might be placed in cages or on spikes in ways that protected them somewhat from birds and weather, while still leaving them visible. The slow decay of these displayed body parts in public view was itself part of the punishment's impact, a reminder of mortality and state power that lingered long after the execution itself. The psychological impact on those who witnessed drawing and quartering, especially repeated viewings, must have been significant. To regularly see bodies destroyed in this manner would surely affect one's worldview and emotional life. Some spectators might have become hardened and desensitized. Others might have been traumatized. Still, others might have internalized the lessons of obedience and fear that the executions were designed to teach. The role of public execution in shaping medieval and early modern consciousness can hardly be overestimated. The religious dimensions of drawing and quartering included provision for the condemned person to receive last rites and make a final confession. A priest or religious official would often accompany the prisoner to the execution site. The condemned might be given opportunity to make a final speech, though this was risky for authorities as it gave the prisoner a platform that could be used for defiance or to proclaim innocence. Some victims used their final words to maintain their cause or to forgive their executioners. Others begged for mercy that would not come. These final speeches were often recorded and circulated, becoming part of the historical record and sometimes the mythology around particular cases. The decline of drawing and quartering came gradually. The last full execution by this method in England occurred in 1782, though technically the punishment remained on the books until 1870. The movement away from such extreme punishments was part of the broader Enlightenment reforms of criminal justice that we have mentioned in relation to other punishments. Reformers argued that such barbaric practices were unworthy of a civilized nation, that they brutalized not just the victim, but also the observers and society as a whole, and that less cruel punishments could be equally effective as deterrents. But even as drawing and quartering disappeared as an actual practice, its legacy persisted. The phrase drawn and quartered entered the language as an expression for being severely punished or torn in different directions. The historical examples of drawing and quartering became reference points in political and legal discussions about the limits of state power and the treatment of political dissidents. And the sheer horror of the punishment ensured that it would be remembered and studied, becoming a symbol of the worst excesses of pre-modern justice. When we reflect on drawing and quartering today, we are confronting not just a historical practice, but a window into a different way of understanding justice, power, and the human body. The medieval and early modern mind saw the body as something that could be appropriated by the state, used as a canvas for demonstrating power, divided and displayed as a text readable by the public. The body of the traitor was not simply killed, but transformed into a message, a warning, a spectacle. This instrumental use of the human body, treating it as a thing rather than as the sacred vessel of a person, represents a profound difference from modern Western values. Though we should remember that similar attitudes toward the bodies of the condemned, the enslaved, and the colonized persisted in various forms well into the modern era. As we move from drawing and quartering to our next topic, we shift focus from public spectacle to more intimate forms of torture, devices that were used in dungeons and torture chambers rather than in public squares. Our next chapter examines the pear of anguish, a device designed to cause internal destruction in ways that strike at the deepest human vulnerability. The pear of anguish, also called the choke pear or the oral pear, represents a particular category of medieval torture device, instruments designed to be inserted into body orifices and then expanded, causing internal damage and excruciating pain. Like the Iron Maiden, the historical reality of the pear of anguish is debated among scholars, with questions about whether the devices that survive in museums are authentic medieval artifacts or later constructions. Regardless of the precise historical truth, the pear of anguish has become firmly established in the popular understanding of medieval torture, and examining it reveals important aspects of how torture targeted not just the body in general, but specific vulnerable parts of the body. The device itself, as it exists in museum collections and historical descriptions, was relatively small, typically about the size of an actual pear, or perhaps slightly larger. It was constructed of metal, usually iron or brass, and fashioned in segments that could separate and expand. At one end was a screw mechanism with a key or handle. The device would be inserted into the body in its closed, compact form. Then the torturer would turn the key, which would cause the segments to gradually separate, expanding the device like a mechanical flower blooming. According to various historical accounts and later interpretations, the pear of anguish was used in different ways, depending on the nature of the victim's alleged crime. For those accused of making heretical statements or blasphemy, the pear might be inserted into the mouth. For women accused of having inappropriate sexual relations or of adultery, it might be inserted into the vagina. For men accused of sodomy, it would be inserted into the anus. This specific targeting of orifices associated with the alleged crimes gave the punishment a symbolic dimension, making it not just about pain, but about connecting the suffering to the specific transgression. Let us first consider the oral use of the pear of anguish. The device would be forced into the victim's mouth, which would immediately create difficulty breathing and intense discomfort. As the key was turned and the segments began to separate, the pear would expand inside the mouth. The sharp points or edges of the segments would press into the soft tissues of the palate, tongue, and inner cheeks. As expansion continued, the jaw would be forced open beyond its normal range. The temporomandibular joint, which connects the jaw to the skull, would be stressed to its limit. In extreme cases, the jaw might be dislocated or broken. The victim would be unable to speak, only to make muffled sounds of agony. Breathing would be severely restricted. The terror of suffocation would be added to the pain of the expanding device. For vaginal insertion, the pear of anguish represented a particularly gendered form of torture, weaponizing women's sexuality against them. The device would be inserted and then expanded, tearing delicate internal tissues. The vaginal walls, the cervix, and potentially deeper structures would be damaged. The pain would be intense and intimate, a violation compounded by agony. Bleeding would be inevitable. Permanent damage to reproductive organs was likely. Beyond the immediate physical trauma, the psychological impact of such intimate violation would be profound and lasting, assuming the victim survived. Anal insertion of the pair of anguish was associated with punishing men accused of homosexual acts, reflecting the intense social and religious condemnation of such relationships in medieval Christian Europe. The anal sphincter muscles, designed to maintain closure and control, would be forcibly dilated beyond their capacity. The rectal walls would be torn. Internal bleeding would occur. The expansion could potentially perforate the rectum, causing life-threatening damage to internal organs and severe infection. The stigma and shame associated with this particular use of the device would be immense, as the victim's alleged sexual transgression would be publicly known through the method of torture employed. The historical evidence for the pair of anguish is problematic. While devices matching the description exist in various museums, including collections of medieval torture instruments, many scholars believe these are fabrications from the 19th or early 20th centuries. The earliest clear references to such devices in historical documents are surprisingly late and vague. No contemporaneous medieval accounts provide detailed descriptions of the device or its use. This has led many historians to conclude that the pair of anguish, at least in the specific form described above, is more likely a product of later imagination than of actual medieval practice. However, as with the Iron Maiden, the potential mythological status of the pair of anguish does not mean that medieval torture was less brutal than the legends suggest. Other forms of torture targeting body orifices definitely existed. Victims were subjected to penetration with various objects. Substances were forcibly introduced into the body through various means. The specific mechanism of the expandable pair may be questionable, but the underlying reality of torture that violated the body's most intimate spaces is well documented. The symbolic logic of the pair of anguish, whether it existed or not, reveals important aspects of medieval punishment ideology. The idea that the punishment should fit the crime, not in a proportional sense but in a symbolic one, was deeply embedded in medieval justice. The tongue that spoke heresy should be tortured. The sexual organs that committed fornication or sodomy should be mutilated. This sympathetic magic approach to justice, where the punishment mirrors the crime, may seem primitive to modern sensibilities, but it made perfect sense within the medieval worldview. The gendered nature of torture, exemplified in the different applications of devices like the pair of anguish, reflects the patriarchal structure of medieval society. Women's sexuality was seen as particularly dangerous and in need of control. Accusations of sexual misconduct against women were common and could be used as pretext for torture and execution. The fact that torture devices specifically targeted female sexual organs demonstrates how punishment reinforced gender hierarchies and controlled women's bodies and behavior. For men accused of homosexual acts, the situation was equally grim but differently inflected. Medieval Christianity condemned same-sex relations as among the gravest sins, often categorizing them with heresy and witchcraft, as crimes against God rather than merely against human law. The punishment for these acts was accordingly severe, and torture designed to destroy or mutilate the anus symbolically attacked the site of the alleged sin. This brutal enforcement of heteronormative sexuality had devastating effects on countless individuals across the medieval period. The privacy of torture using devices like the pair of anguish contrasts with the public spectacle of executions we have examined in previous chapters. While major executions were public events, much torture took place in dungeons, hidden from general view. This privacy served several functions. It made the torture more psychologically terrifying, as the victim was isolated without witnesses to their suffering. It allowed torturers to extract confessions without public scrutiny of their methods, and it created an aura of mystery and fear around what might happen in the torture chamber, making the threat of torture as powerful as the reality. The medical consequences of torture with a pair of anguish or similar devices would be severe and often permanent. Survivors would face chronic pain, disfigurement, and disability. Infection was almost inevitable given the non-sterile conditions and the nature of the injuries. Many victims likely died, not from the immediate torture, but from subsequent infection and complications. Those who survived physically would carry psychological scars, trauma from violation and pain that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The role of confession in justifying such torture is crucial to understand. Medieval legal systems often required confession to convict someone of serious crimes. Torture was seen as a legitimate method for obtaining these confessions. The logic was that only the guilty would confess under torture, while the innocent would maintain their innocence no matter how much pain they suffered. We now know this logic is entirely false. Torture produces unreliable confessions, with victims saying whatever they think the torturer wants to hear simply to make the pain stop. But this understanding came slowly and against resistance from legal systems that had invested heavily in torture as an investigative tool. The economic aspects of torture were significant. Torture devices had to be manufactured, maintained, and operated. Torturers had to be paid. Dungeon spaces had to be maintained. These costs were sometimes passed on to the accused or their families, adding financial ruin to their other suffering. In some cases, the confiscated property of the convicted would pay for the costs of their torture and execution, creating a perverse economic incentive for authorities to pursue accusations against wealthy individuals. The religious justification for torture, particularly sexual torture, drew on complex theological arguments. Medieval Christianity held that the body and its desires were sources of sin. Mortification of the flesh through self-imposed suffering was a recognized path to holiness. Some theologians extended this logic to argue that torture, by causing the body to suffer, could actually benefit the soul, especially if it led to confession and repentance. This provided a framework where torture could be seen not just as punishment, but as a kind of violent spiritual medicine. The psychological state of victims before, during, and after torture with devices like the pair of anguish can barely be imagined. The anticipation would be agonizing. Being led to the torture chamber, seeing the devices, hearing them described, all of this would create terror. During the torture, the overwhelming pain would likely eclipse all other thoughts. After, assuming survival, victims would face physical pain, psychological trauma, social stigma, and often continued imprisonment or further punishment. The totality of this suffering represents violence on every level: physical, psychological, social, and spiritual. The question of why humans create such devices, why we apply our ingenuity to causing suffering, is one of the deepest and most troubling questions in human history. The pair of anguish, whether real or legendary, represents the application of mechanical skill to the purpose of intimate violation. Someone designed this device, someone manufactured it, someone used it. At each stage, human agency was involved, human choices were made. Understanding this is uncomfortable but necessary if we are to understand the full range of human capacity for both creation and destruction. Modern torture, though it often avoids the elaborate devices of medieval times, sometimes employs similar principles. Sexual torture and violation remain common in conflict zones and authoritarian regimes. The use of objects for penetration and internal injury continues. The targeting of specific body parts to create maximum psychological as well as physical impact persists. In this sense, the pair of anguish, even if it never existed in medieval times, remains relevant as a symbol of the kinds of intimate violence that humans continue to inflict on each other. As we move from the pair of anguish to our next chapter, we shift our attention to a systematic institution of torture, the Inquisition. Where individual devices like the rack or the pair cause suffering on a personal scale, the Inquisition represented torture as bureaucracy, cruelty as administrative process, with secret chambers and formal procedures that turned the extraction of confessions and the punishment of heresy into a routine matter of church governance. The Inquisition represents something different from the individual torture devices and execution methods we have examined so far. It was not a device or a specific punishment, but an institution, a vast apparatus of investigation, interrogation, trial, torture, and execution that spanned centuries and continents. The Inquisition transformed torture from isolated incidents into systematic policy, creating bureaucratic structures and legal procedures around the infliction of suffering. Understanding the Inquisition is essential to understanding how torture became normalized and regularized in medieval and early modern Europe. The term Inquisition actually refers to several related but distinct institutions. The medieval Inquisition, established in the 12th century, was the Catholic Church's response to heretical movements in France and elsewhere. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, was controlled by the Spanish monarchy and focused initially on converted Jews and Muslims suspected of secretly maintaining their former faiths. The Portuguese Inquisition and the Roman Inquisition were additional variations. Each had somewhat different procedures and priorities, but all shared a commitment to identifying and punishing heresy through investigation and torture, if necessary. The Inquisition's methods were characterized by their combination of secrecy and formality. Unlike public executions which we have examined, much of the Inquisition's work took place behind closed doors. Accusations could be made secretly, sometimes anonymously. Investigations were conducted without the accused knowing they were under suspicion. When suspects were arrested, they might not be told what they were accused of, forcing them to try to guess what the Inquisition wanted to hear. This atmosphere of secrecy and uncertainty was itself a form of psychological torture, creating fear and paranoia throughout communities where the Inquisition operated. The torture chambers of the Inquisition were typically located in the basements or lower levels of buildings controlled by the Church, or by secular authorities cooperating with the Inquisition. These spaces were deliberately designed to be intimidating and disorienting. They were often accessed through confusing passages or multiple locked doors, emphasizing the victim's separation from the normal world. The chambers themselves were windowless, lit by torches or candles that created flickering shadows. The walls were stone, cold, and damp. The air would be stale and often foul. Various torture devices would be visible, arranged as much for their psychological impact as for their functional use. The Inquisition employed many of the torture methods we have already examined: the rack, strappado, crushing devices, and others. But the Inquisition's use of torture had particular characteristics shaped by its religious mission and legal framework. Torture sessions were formally regulated. There were official limits on how long torture could continue and how many times a person could be tortured, though these limits were often circumvented through technical reinterpretations. For example, the rule might state that torture could not be repeated, but torturers would claim they were not repeating torture, but rather continuing a previous session that had been temporarily suspended. One of the most common torture methods used by the Inquisition was strappado, also known as the pendulum or reverse hanging. The victim's hands would be tied behind their back, and then they would be hoisted up by a rope attached to their wrists, suspending them in the air with their arms pulled up and back behind them. This position is extremely painful within minutes, placing enormous stress on the shoulder joints, stretching the ligaments, and potentially dislocating the shoulders. Victims would be left hanging for extended periods, or sometimes dropped suddenly and stopped just before hitting the ground, creating a jerking motion that could tear muscles and ligaments. Weights might be added to the victim's feet during strappado, increasing the stress on the body. The torturer would ask questions, demanding confession or names of accomplices. If the victim gave satisfactory answers, they might be lowered. If not, they would be left hanging longer, or weights would be added, or they would be dropped and jerked to a stop. The combination of pain, fear, and the promise of relief, if confession was made, created intense pressure to say whatever the inquisitors wanted to hear. Another method favored by the Inquisition was the rack, which we have already examined in detail, but its use by the Inquisition had particular features. The stretching would be done gradually, with pauses for questioning. The victim would be asked to confess to heresy, to name others involved in heretical practices, to describe their beliefs and activities in detail. The torture would intensify if answers were deemed unsatisfactory. And because the Inquisition kept detailed records, they would compare victims' statements against those of others, looking for consistency or contradictions that could indicate truth or lies, though of course torture itself makes such comparison meaningless, as victims under torture will say anything. Water torture was also used extensively. In one form, the victim would be tied to a board or bench, tilted with their head lower than their feet. Their nose would be pinched shut and a cloth placed over their mouth. Water would then be poured slowly over the cloth, forcing the victim to inhale small amounts of water, creating the sensation and reality of drowning. This method left no permanent marks, which made it attractive to torturers who wanted to extract confessions without visible evidence of torture. The psychological terror of drowning combined with the physical distress of being unable to breathe created intense suffering. Another water torture variant involved forcing large quantities of water into the victim's stomach through a funnel, often mixed with harsh substances. The victim's abdomen would distend painfully. The pressure on internal organs would be excruciating. The victim might vomit, and then more water would be forced in. This method could cause internal injuries and, in extreme cases, could rupture the stomach or intestines. The foot roasting or boots was another Inquisition favorite. The victim's feet would be placed in metal boots or stocks. A fire would be built nearby, and the victim's feet would be held close to the flames or placed directly in burning coals. Fat or oil might be applied to the feet to intensify the heat and increase the damage. The flesh would burn, creating intense pain. The smell would be horrendous. The victim would be unable to escape, forced to watch their own feet being destroyed while the inquisitors asked their questions. The procedural formality of Inquisition torture is one of its most disturbing aspects. There were rules. There were forms to be filled out. Permission had to be obtained from higher authorities before torture could be employed. Medical personnel were sometimes present to ensure the victim did not die during torture, as death would prevent confession and conviction. All of this bureaucratic structure created a veneer of legitimacy around practices that were fundamentally brutal and unjust. The Inquisition's target victims changed over time and varied by location. Initially, the primary targets were Christian heretics, Cathars in southern France, Waldensians, and members of other sects deemed heretical by the Catholic Church. Later, as we have mentioned, the Spanish Inquisition focused heavily on conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, but were suspected of secretly maintaining Jewish practices, and Moriscos, converted Muslims under similar suspicion. The Portuguese Inquisition, established in 1536, had similar priorities. The witch hunts, which peaked in the 16th and 17th centuries, involved various authorities including, but not limited to, the Inquisition. In some regions, the Inquisition was actually more skeptical of witchcraft accusations than secular courts, but in other areas, the Inquisition actively pursued accused witches, using torture to extract confessions of pacts with the devil, attendance at witches' sabbaths, and the performance of harmful magic. The infamous manual for witch hunters, the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487, provided detailed instructions for identifying and interrogating suspected witches, including recommended torture methods. The psychological manipulation employed by the Inquisition was sophisticated. Victims would be isolated, held in cells where they might not know if it was day or night, deprived of regular food and sleep. They would be visited by inquisitors who might alternate between threats and false kindness, between describing in detail what tortures awaited and offering mercy if confession was made. Family members might be arrested and threatened, adding to the pressure on the victim. Some victims were shown their loved ones being tortured, breaking their will to resist. The use of confession in Inquisition proceedings reveals the institution's fundamental dishonesty. Confession was required for conviction in many cases, but confession extracted under torture was obviously unreliable. The Inquisition attempted to address this by requiring that confessions made under torture be confirmed later, away from the torture chamber, without duress. But victims who had been tortured knew that if they recanted their confession, they would simply be tortured again until they confessed again. This created a system where torture inevitably produced the confessions desired, regardless of truth. The punishments for those convicted by the Inquisition varied. Some faced relatively light penalties, public penance, fines, restrictions on where they could live, or what occupations they could pursue. Others faced imprisonment, which could range from house arrest to dungeons where conditions were brutal. And those deemed unrepentant heretics faced execution, typically by burning at the stake. The Inquisition maintained the legal fiction that it did not execute anyone, instead handing convicted heretics over to secular authorities for punishment. But this distinction was transparently hypocritical. The auto da fe, the public ceremony at which the Inquisition announced verdicts and handed over those to be executed, was an elaborate spectacle. These events could last hours or even days. They would include processions, public readings of charges and sentences, religious sermons, and finally the executions themselves. The auto da fe served multiple purposes, demonstrating the power of the Inquisition, providing public entertainment, teaching moral lessons to the crowd, and satisfying demands for justice or revenge. The economic impact of the Inquisition on its victims was often devastating even for those not executed. The Inquisition could confiscate the property of those convicted. This created an economic incentive for pursuing accusations against wealthy individuals. Families could be financially ruined by the conviction of one member. The fear of Inquisition investigation could destroy businesses and social relationships. Some people fled regions where the Inquisition operated, creating refugee communities in places like the Netherlands that were more tolerant. The social control function of the Inquisition extended beyond its direct victims. The knowledge that one could be accused, investigated, tortured, and possibly executed for wrong beliefs created a climate of fear and conformity. People learned to watch what they said, to avoid controversial topics, to demonstrate their orthodoxy publicly and regularly. Neighbors might inform on each other. Children might report their parents. The Inquisition created a society of surveillance and suspicion, where trust was eroded and individualism was dangerous. The intellectual impact of the Inquisition was also significant. It discouraged questioning and critical thinking about religious matters. It enforced conformity in belief and practice. Scientists and philosophers who challenged orthodox views risked Inquisition investigation. While the popular image of the Inquisition suppressing all scientific progress is exaggerated, there were certainly cases where the Inquisition impeded intellectual development and punished innovative thinkers. Galileo's trial by the Roman Inquisition in 1633 for supporting heliocentrism is a famous example, though he was treated relatively leniently compared to many Inquisition victims. The resistance to the Inquisition took various forms. Some refused to confess even under torture, maintaining their innocence or their heretical beliefs to the death. Others fled to regions outside Inquisition control. Still others conformed outwardly while maintaining their beliefs privately, creating communities of secret religious practice. Intellectuals and reformers critiqued the Inquisition, pointing out its injustices and its use of torture. These critiques gradually gained influence, contributing to the eventual decline of the Inquisition. The decline of the Inquisition was gradual and uneven. The Spanish Inquisition, which was among the last to be abolished, officially ended in 1834. The Roman Inquisition evolved into the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which still exists as part of the Catholic Church's structure, but without the coercive powers of its predecessor. The end of the Inquisition came through a combination of Enlightenment criticism, political changes, and shifting religious attitudes. The very things that had made the Inquisition powerful, its secrecy, its use of torture, its suppression of dissent, came to be seen as shameful rather than righteous. The legacy of the Inquisition remains contested. The Catholic Church has offered apologies for some of the Inquisition's actions, acknowledging errors and excesses while sometimes defending the Inquisition's intentions. Historians continue to debate the number of victims, the degree of popular support or opposition, and the Inquisition's overall impact on European society. What is clear is that the Inquisition represents one of history's most systematic applications of torture and religious persecution, an institution that turned violence into bureaucracy and cruelty into policy. As we move from the Inquisition's secret chambers to our next chapter, we return to the public arena, to the streets and squares, where executions became entertainment and moral lessons for the masses. Our next topic is public executions as entertainment, examining how death became spectacle and what this reveals about medieval and early modern society. Throughout our exploration of medieval punishments, we have repeatedly encountered the public dimension of execution and torture, but we have not yet fully examined this public quality as a phenomenon in itself. Public executions were not simply private acts of killing that happened to take place outdoors. They were carefully staged performances, events that brought together thousands of people, that shaped public consciousness, and that served multiple social, political, and psychological functions. To understand medieval punishment fully, we must understand the execution as spectacle. The decision to make executions public was not accidental or merely practical. It was a deliberate choice rooted in the logic of deterrence and social control. Medieval authorities believed that punishment must be visible to be effective. If criminals were simply killed behind closed doors, their punishment would not serve as a warning to others. But if executions were public, spectacular, and memorable, they would discourage crime through fear. This theory of deterrence through terror was fundamental to medieval justice. The locations chosen for public executions were significant. In cities, the main square or marketplace was often used. The center of commercial and social life transformed temporarily into a theater of death. In London, Tyburn was the principal execution site for centuries, located at what is now Marble Arch. In Paris, the Place de Grève served a similar function. These locations were chosen for their accessibility and visibility. They could accommodate large crowds. They were associated in the public mind with justice and authority. The architecture of execution reflected its importance. Permanent gallows might be erected, structures that stood as constant reminders of what awaited criminals. Scaffolds were built with attention to visibility, raised platforms that allowed crowds to see the execution clearly. In some cases, temporary stands might be erected for nobility and officials to watch in relative comfort. The execution space was staged like a theater, with the condemned person and the executioner as the central actors. The timing of executions was also significant. They might be scheduled for market days when crowds would already be in the city. They might follow major religious holidays. Multiple executions might be grouped together to create a larger spectacle. Execution days became part of the calendar of urban life, anticipated events that broke the routine of daily existence. Workers might be given time off to attend. Schools might bring children to witness the moral lesson. The procession to the execution site was itself a performance. The condemned person would be paraded through the streets, often in a cart or on foot, sometimes preceded by officials and priests, surrounded by guards. The route might deliberately pass through certain neighborhoods or past the location where the crime was committed. The condemned might be subjected to jeers and thrown objects from the crowd, or in some cases, sympathetic crowds might pray for them or express support. The procession was a journey from one state of being to another, from life to death, from person to warning. Upon reaching the execution site, there were further rituals to be observed. The condemned person might be given opportunity to make a final speech. These speeches were closely attended to by the crowd. A speech showing repentance and accepting the justice of the punishment served the authorities' purposes, confirming that the system was right and just. But sometimes the condemned used their final words for defiance, to proclaim their innocence, to denounce their accusers, or to maintain their cause. These defiant speeches could be powerful and could turn crowd sympathy toward the victim and against the authorities. Religious officials played important roles in execution ceremonies. Priests or ministers would attend the condemned, offering prayers and urging repentance. They would remain present through the execution itself. This religious presence served multiple functions. It offered the condemned person a chance at salvation for their soul. It demonstrated that the church sanctioned the execution, and it provided a framework of meaning that made the violence seem purposeful rather than merely cruel. The priest represented mercy even in the midst of ultimate violence. The executioner was a central figure in this drama. In some places, executioners wore distinctive clothing or masks. They might have to live in specific areas separate from respectable society, yet their role was essential, and a skilled executioner commanded respect and could earn significant income. The executioner's skill or lack thereof affected the crowd's experience. A quick, clean execution might be seen as a mercy and a sign of professionalism. A botched execution, where the condemned suffered excessively or death was slow, could anger the crowd and create disorder. The crowd itself was not simply passive. The audience at public executions was active, responsive, and sometimes unpredictable. Crowds might express approval through cheers, especially if the criminal was particularly hated or the crime particularly heinous. They might express disapproval through boos or silence. In some cases, crowds rioted, attempting to prevent executions they viewed as unjust, or to attack those they viewed as getting away with crimes. The crowd was, in a sense, a participant in the execution, providing the public judgment that legitimized or delegitimized the proceedings. The commercialization of public executions was extensive. Vendors sold food, drink, and souvenirs. Ballads about famous criminals and their crimes were printed and sold. Pamphlets describing the crimes and executions circulated widely. Images were produced and sold. The execution was not just a legal proceeding, but an economic event, generating income for numerous people. This commercial aspect might seem grotesque to modern sensibilities, but it was simply part of how medieval and early modern society functioned. The souvenirs from executions were particularly macabre. Pieces of the rope used for hanging were considered to bring good luck and were highly sought after. Bits of clothing from the condemned might be taken. In some cases, people believed that body parts or blood from executed criminals had magical or medicinal properties. An executed criminal's hand might be sought for various folk magic purposes. This commodification of the executed body demonstrates the complex attitudes toward death and the dead in this period. Children's presence at executions was common and considered appropriate. Parents brought their children to teach them about the consequences of wrongdoing. The execution was seen as an educational event, a moral lesson delivered in the most dramatic way possible. We can only speculate about the psychological impact on children of witnessing extreme violence, but it surely contributed to a different relationship with death and suffering than modern children typically have. The experience of different classes at executions varied. The wealthy and powerful might watch from special vantage points, protected from the worst of the crowd. They could arrive and leave easily. They treated the execution as entertainment, one event among many in their social calendar. The poor and common people, by contrast, might spend hours jostling for position in the crowd, might be pickpocketed or robbed while distracted, might face dangers from crowd crushes and stampedes that sometimes occurred at popular executions. Yet, for them too, the execution was entertainment, a break from labor and daily routine. The gender dynamics of execution crowds are interesting. Both men and women attended in large numbers. Women might be particularly prominent in crowds at witch executions, though whether this was because they were more concerned about witchcraft or for other reasons is debated. Executions could be occasions for sexual assault and harassment in the crowded conditions. The execution itself sometimes had sexual overtones, particularly in cases involving sexual crimes, or when the condemned was young and attractive. The relationship between public executions and crime rates is questionable. The deterrent effect that authorities expected was likely minimal. Studies of crime rates in periods with frequent public executions show no clear reduction in crime. In fact, executions themselves sometimes created crime. As pickpockets worked the crowds and vendors might be robbed. The large gatherings could descend into riots and disorder. The execution that was supposed to demonstrate state power and prevent crime sometimes instead showed the limits of state control. The desensitization effect of frequent public executions should be considered. In periods and places where executions were common, people became accustomed to seeing death and suffering. This might have contributed to a generally higher level of tolerance for violence in society. On the other hand, some scholars argue that people in the past were not necessarily more callous, but rather had developed different coping mechanisms for dealing with violence that was more visible and common in their daily lives than in our own. The role of alcohol at executions was significant. Both the condemned and the crowd often drank heavily. The condemned might be given alcohol as a mercy to dull their fear and pain. The crowd drank as part of the festival atmosphere. Executions and taverns were closely associated. The executioner and their assistants might drink before and after their work. This combination of alcohol and violence contributed to the potentially chaotic nature of execution events. The media coverage of executions, in the form of pamphlets, ballads, and later newspapers, extended their impact beyond those who physically attended. Accounts of famous executions circulated widely, often embellished or fictionalized. These accounts created celebrities out of some criminals, making their crimes and deaths part of popular culture. The figure of the criminal hero, someone who defied authority and faced death bravely, emerged from these execution accounts. Figures like Dick Turpin in England became legends partly through the stories told about their executions. The variability of crowd reactions at executions reveals important social dynamics. When authorities executed someone popular, or when the crime seemed minor or the trial seemed unfair, crowds might express disapproval. This created a check, however weak, on the arbitrary use of execution power. Authorities had to consider public opinion to some degree. An execution that produced riots or strong opposition might be counterproductive. This meant that the public execution, while designed to demonstrate state power, actually revealed the limits of that power and the importance of maintaining at least a degree of popular consent. The changing attitudes toward public execution began in the 18th century. Enlightenment thinkers criticized public executions as barbaric and brutalizing to society. They argued that execution should be quick and private rather than prolonged and public. Reformers contended that the execution spectacle created sympathy for criminals rather than respect for law. Gradually, various jurisdictions moved executions behind prison walls, away from public view. France abolished public executions in 1939. The United States moved toward private executions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The last public execution in the United States occurred in 1936. The decline of medieval punishment practices was not a single event, but a gradual process that unfolded over several centuries and varied considerably across different regions and jurisdictions. Understanding why these brutal practices eventually gave way to less cruel forms of punishment requires examining changes in philosophy, religion, politics, economics, and social organization. The story of this decline is as important as the story of the punishments themselves, revealing much about how societies change and how notions of justice evolve. The philosophical foundations for critiquing medieval punishment emerged during the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria, whose 1764 work on crimes and punishments was enormously influential, argued that punishment should be proportional to the crime, that it should be certain and swift rather than severe and theatrical, and that torture should be abolished as both cruel and ineffective. Beccaria's work was radical for its time, questioning assumptions that had underpinned criminal justice for centuries. Beccaria argued that torture was counterproductive because it privileged the strong over the weak. A strong, stubborn person might resist torture and go free even if guilty, while a weak or sensitive person might confess to anything, even if innocent. Torture thus perverted justice rather than serving it. Furthermore, Beccaria argued that the purpose of punishment should be deterrence and the prevention of future crimes, not revenge or the demonstration of sovereign power. This utilitarian approach to justice represented a fundamental shift from medieval thinking. John Howard, the English prison reformer, contributed to changing attitudes through his investigations of prison conditions across Europe in the late 18th century. His book, The State of the Prisons in England and Wales, published in 1777, documented appalling conditions and made a strong case for reform. Howard argued that imprisonment could be used not just for punishment, but for reformation of criminals, introducing the idea that punishment might have a rehabilitative purpose. This was a radical departure from medieval views of punishment as simply retribution or deterrence. The changing religious landscape also contributed to the decline of medieval punishments. The Protestant Reformation had broken the Catholic Church's monopoly on religious authority in much of Europe. This weakened institutions like the Inquisition in Protestant countries. Moreover, both Protestant and Catholic reformers began to develop new theological approaches to sin and redemption that emphasized individual conscience and divine mercy more than earthly suffering. While religious persecution and cruel punishment certainly continued, the theological justifications for torture and extreme cruelty became increasingly contested. The rise of the modern state played a crucial role. Medieval justice had been fragmented across multiple authorities: kings, nobles, church courts, city councils, guilds. All had some jurisdiction over different types of crimes and different groups of people. As centralized nation-states developed, they sought to rationalize and standardize their legal systems. Elaborate public torture and execution were expensive and time-consuming. They required skilled executioners, elaborate equipment, and the coordination of multiple officials. As states developed more efficient bureaucracies and professional police forces, the need for spectacular deterrent punishments seemed less pressing. The practical ineffectiveness of torture and extreme punishment also became more apparent. Crime rates did not noticeably decline in response to brutal punishments. Torture produced unreliable confessions. Public executions sometimes generated sympathy for criminals rather than respect for law. Officials and jurists who had to deal with the actual implementation of justice became increasingly aware of these problems. Practical considerations thus combined with philosophical critiques to create pressure for change. Economic changes also played a role. The development of capitalism and industrial production created new views of the body and labor. The medieval approach of destroying criminal bodies through torture and execution came to seem wasteful. Bodies could be productive, their labor valuable. Imprisonment and forced labor began to seem like more economically rational punishments than execution. This economic logic was not necessarily more humane, as it led to brutal prison labor systems and the use of convict labor in colonies. But it did contribute to moving away from torture and public execution. The changing nature of warfare and military discipline also influenced punishment practices. As armies became more professional and disciplined, military justice moved away from some of the most brutal medieval practices. The experience of military leaders in managing large organizations and maintaining discipline through means other than spectacular violence influenced civilian justice systems. The idea that discipline could be maintained through surveillance, routine, and the threat of moderate but certain punishment began to replace reliance on extreme violence. The development of new forms of media and public discourse created new contexts for discussing punishment. The printing press, which had been developed in the 15th century, made possible a much wider circulation of ideas. By the 18th century, newspapers, pamphlets, and books could reach large audiences. Critiques of torture and cruel punishment could spread more easily. Public opinion began to matter more as literacy increased and as commercial media created new forms of public sphere. The discussion of justice was no longer confined to officials and theologians, but became a matter of broader public debate. Specific legal reforms occurred at different times in different places. Prussia under Frederick the Great abolished torture in 1754. Other German states followed over the next several decades. France abolished judicial torture in 1789. At the beginning of the French Revolution, though the revolutionary period itself saw new forms of mass execution, like the guillotine, England had moved away from most forms of judicial torture somewhat earlier, though brutal punishments like transportation and harsh imprisonment continued. The abolition of specific practices was often piecemeal and gradual. Drawing and quartering might be abolished while other brutal punishments continued. Burning at the stake might end while hanging continued. The rack might be removed from the Tower of London, while flogging continued in the military and merchant marine. This gradual process reflected the fact that reform was contested and incomplete, with different groups having different interests and different views about appropriate punishment. The role of colonies and imperial expansion in the history of punishment is complex. European powers sometimes exported their brutal punishment practices to their colonies, using torture and spectacular execution to control colonized populations. At the same time, reformers sometimes pointed to these colonial practices as evidence that cruel punishment was associated with tyranny and backwardness. The colonized people's resistance to European rule and justice systems also created pressure for change, though this resistance was often brutally suppressed. The development of the penitentiary, the modern prison designed for long-term incarceration, provided an alternative to execution and torture. The very word penitentiary suggests its religious origins, the idea that imprisonment could lead to penitence and reformation. The first modern penitentiaries were developed in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in places like Philadelphia. These institutions were designed to isolate prisoners, to subject them to routine and discipline, and theoretically to reform them through reflection and work. Whether penitentiaries actually represented progress is debatable, as prison conditions were often brutal, and the system of mass incarceration created its own forms of cruelty, but they did represent a move away from medieval forms of punishment. The persistence of cruel punishment despite formal abolition should be acknowledged. Even after torture was officially abolished in many places, it continued in practice under different names or in specific contexts. Police brutality, military discipline, colonial punishment, and prison conditions often involve practices that would have been recognized as torture in earlier periods. The move away from medieval punishment was thus incomplete and uneven, with brutal practices continuing in modified forms. The role of specific scandals and cases in driving reform should not be underestimated. Particular cases of obvious injustice or extreme cruelty could galvanize public opinion and create pressure for change. The torture and execution of Jean Calas in France in 1762 a Protestant wrongly convicted of murdering his son, became a cause célèbre thanks to Voltaire's advocacy. This case, and others like it, demonstrated the dangers of torture and the possibility of fatal miscarriages of justice, strengthening the hand of reformers. The impact of revolutions, particularly the American and French revolutions, was significant. These revolutions were accompanied by new declarations of rights that included protections against cruel and unusual punishment. The United States Constitution's Eighth Amendment, ratified in 1791, prohibited cruel and unusual punishments. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, adopted in 1789, similarly addressed punishment, stating that it should be no more than is strictly and obviously necessary. These constitutional protections created legal frameworks that made brutal medieval-style punishments more difficult to justify or maintain. The role of women in prison reform movements was important and often overlooked. Women like Elizabeth Fry in England advocated for better prison conditions, particularly for female prisoners. While their reform efforts were shaped by their own class positions and sometimes paternalistic attitudes, they contributed to broader movements for more humane treatment of prisoners and to questioning the utility and morality of brutal punishment. The development of criminology as a field of study, beginning in the 19th century, contributed to changing views of crime and punishment. Early criminologists attempted to understand the causes of criminal behavior scientifically. While some of their theories, particularly those involving racial and biological determinism, were deeply flawed and harmful, the attempt to understand crime as a social problem with causes that could be addressed represented a shift from medieval views of crime as simply sin or wickedness requiring brutal punishment. The changing views of children in childhood also affected punishment practices. Medieval law had generally treated children above a certain age, often quite young, as fully responsible for their crimes and subject to the same punishments as adults. By the 19th century, the concept of juvenile delinquency emerged, with the idea that children were different from adults and should be treated differently by the justice system. Juvenile courts and reformatories were developed, attempting to combine punishment with education and reform. The role of international pressure and exchange of ideas across borders contributed to the spread of reforms. Reformers in different countries corresponded with each other, shared ideas, and pointed to reforms in other nations as examples to follow. International congresses on prison reform and criminal justice began to be held in the 19th century. While nationalism and imperial competition remained powerful forces, there was also development of international norms around punishment that created pressure for countries to conform to increasingly humane standards. The incomplete nature of reform must be emphasized. While medieval forms of torture and execution largely disappeared from official legal systems in Europe and North America by the late 19th century, they persisted in other contexts and other parts of the world. Colonial powers often used brutal punishment in their colonies. Authoritarian regimes used torture. Unofficial violence, including lynching and mob violence, continued to use methods reminiscent of medieval punishment. The 20th century saw systematic use of torture by totalitarian regimes, despite international laws against it. The story of the decline of medieval punishment is thus not a simple narrative of progress, but a complex and ongoing struggle. As we move to our final chapter, we will examine how medieval punishment has shaped modern law and justice systems. Even though we have moved away from many medieval practices, their legacy persists in complex ways, influencing how we think about crime, justice, punishment, and the relationship between the individual and the state. As we approach the end of our 3-hour journey through the dark history of medieval punishments, it is essential to consider how this brutal past continues to shape our present. The legacy of medieval justice is not simply a matter of historical curiosity. It has profoundly influenced the development of modern legal systems, concepts of justice, human rights discourse, and popular culture. Understanding this legacy helps us recognize both how far we have come and how much of the past still lingers in our institutions and attitudes. The modern concept of human rights emerged partly as a reaction against medieval and early modern practices of torture and cruel punishment. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, explicitly prohibits torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. This prohibition is enshrined in numerous international treaties and national constitutions. The very concept that humans have inherent dignity that cannot be violated by the state, regardless of what crimes they may have committed, represents a fundamental rejection of the medieval approach to punishment, where the bodies of criminals could be appropriated and destroyed by authorities. However, the relationship between this rights framework and actual practice remains complicated. Torture has not disappeared despite its prohibition. Numerous countries continue to practice torture, often in the name of national security or counterterrorism. Even countries that pride themselves on respecting human rights have been implicated in torture programs, as revelations about CIA practices after September 11, 2001, demonstrated. The persistence of torture shows that the legacy of medieval practices is not simply historical, but continues to exert influence, particularly in situations of fear and perceived emergency. The modern criminal justice system retains many structures and concepts that originated in medieval times. The adversarial system of justice, where prosecution and defense contest before a judge, has medieval roots. The jury system, where ordinary citizens participate in determining guilt, evolved from medieval practices. The concept of presumption of innocence, though strengthened and formalized over time, can be traced back to medieval legal principles. Even as we have rejected medieval punishments, we have retained and developed many of the institutional forms that surrounded those punishments. The prison system, which dominates modern punishment in most of the world, represents both continuity with and departure from medieval practices. On one hand, long-term imprisonment is less cruel than torture and execution, representing what might be seen as progress. On the other hand, mass incarceration creates its own forms of suffering and raises questions about whether locking people in cages for years or decades is truly more humane than shorter, but more intense punishments. The United States, with the world's highest incarceration rate, might be seen as having replaced one form of extreme punishment with another. The death penalty, where it still exists, shows the most direct continuity with medieval practices. While modern executions are designed to be quick and supposedly painless, using methods like lethal injection, they still involve the state deliberately ending a human life as punishment for crime. The debates around capital punishment today echo medieval concerns, questions of deterrence, of justice for victims, of the possibility of executing innocents, of the morality of taking life. Countries and states that have abolished the death penalty have done so, partly based on lessons learned from the history of execution, including its medieval forms. The legal concept of proportionality in punishment, the idea that punishment should fit the crime, represents both connection to and departure from medieval justice. Medieval law had its own concept of proportionality, though it was symbolic and theatrical rather than measured. Modern proportionality aims to be more rational and consistent, but the underlying idea that some crimes deserve harsher punishment than others links modern and medieval thinking. The role of public opinion in justice, which was so important in medieval public executions, continues in modified forms. Media coverage of trials, particularly in sensational cases, creates a kind of modern spectacle that serves some of the same functions as medieval public executions. The public follows these cases, forms opinions about guilt and innocence, and sometimes influences outcomes through the pressure of public opinion. The desire to see justice done, to see criminals punished, remains a powerful force in modern society, as it was in medieval times. Popular culture's fascination with medieval punishments reveals something about contemporary psychology. Torture devices and execution methods appear regularly in horror films, crime dramas, and historical fiction. Museums display torture devices, attracting tourists who pay to see these instruments of suffering. Video games include torture and execution. This cultural obsession suggests that medieval brutality continues to exert a morbid fascination, perhaps allowing modern people to experience vicariously the intensity and extremity that is mostly absent from their everyday lives. The educational use of medieval punishment history, including documentaries like this one, serves multiple purposes. It can be genuinely educational, teaching about historical realities and how justice systems have evolved. It can serve as moral warning, demonstrating the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of protecting human rights. But it can also be prurient, satisfying a curiosity about violence and suffering that may not be entirely healthy. The line between education and exploitation in discussing these topics is not always clear. The influence of medieval punishment on literature and art has been profound. From Shakespeare's plays with their executions and torture to modern Gothic and horror fiction, creative artists have repeatedly returned to these themes. The works of the Marquis de Sade, though written in the 18th century, drew explicitly on medieval and early modern torture practices. Edgar Allan Poe's The Pit and the Pendulum used Inquisition torture as its central horror. These and countless other works show how medieval punishment has provided material for exploring themes of power, suffering, justice, and human nature. The way we remember and commemorate victims of historical injustice shows the legacy of medieval punishment. Sites of former executions and torture sometimes become memorials. Joan of Arc, burned as a heretic, is now a saint and a national hero of France. The victims of witch hunts are commemorated in various places. These acts of remembrance represent attempts to come to terms with past injustices and to honor those who suffered. They also reflect modern values being projected backward onto history, using the past to make statements about the present. The legal protections against cruel and unusual punishment that exist in many countries stem directly from reactions against medieval practices. The Eighth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, has been interpreted to limit various punishment practices. Similar provisions exist in other nations' laws. These protections represent the institutionalization of Enlightenment critiques of medieval justice, making it harder for governments to return to brutal practices without violating their own fundamental laws. However, debates continue about what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. Is solitary confinement, which can cause severe psychological damage, cruel and unusual? Are conditions in overcrowded, violent prisons cruel and unusual? Is execution by any method cruel and unusual? These questions show that the basic framework established in reaction to medieval punishment remains relevant and contested. The development of international humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions that regulate the treatment of prisoners of war, shows the influence of historical lessons about torture and cruelty. These laws attempt to set limits on what can be done even to enemy combatants, even in wartime. While violations of these laws remain common, their existence represents a global consensus, at least in principle, that certain forms of cruelty are unacceptable regardless of circumstances. The professionalization of criminal justice, including the development of professional police forces, forensic science, and trained judges and lawyers, represents a move away from the arbitrary and often corrupt justice of medieval times. Modern justice systems aim to be rational, consistent, and based on evidence rather than on torture-extracted confessions or trials by ordeal. While these systems often fail to live up to their ideals, the ideals themselves represent important advances. The concept of rehabilitation, the idea that criminals can be reformed and returned to society, represents a significant departure from medieval views of punishment as purely retributive or deterrent. While medieval justice sometimes allowed for mercy and redemption in spiritual terms, the systematic attempt to rehabilitate criminals through education, therapy, and training is largely a modern development. Whether rehabilitation programs actually work is debated, but the concept itself shows a different understanding of crime and criminals than prevailed in medieval times. The attention to innocence and wrongful conviction in modern justice represents another advance over medieval practices. DNA evidence has exonerated numerous people who were wrongly convicted, sometimes after decades in prison. This has led to reforms designed to prevent wrongful convictions. The medieval justice system, which used torture to extract confessions and had little interest in evidence beyond confession, routinely convicted innocent people. Modern reforms, while imperfect, represent serious attempts to address this problem. The rise of restorative justice approaches, which focus on healing harm and reconciling offenders with victims and communities rather than simply punishing, represents a significant departure from medieval retributive justice. While still relatively marginal in most justice systems, restorative justice programs show that alternative approaches to dealing with crime are possible. These approaches draw on various traditions, including some pre-modern indigenous justice systems, showing that the path away from medieval punishment is not simply about modernization, but about recovering wisdom from various sources. The globalization of justice norms, including the development of international criminal courts like the International Criminal Court, shows both progress and challenges. These institutions attempt to hold individuals accountable for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, extending justice across national borders. At the same time, they face resistance from powerful nations and have had mixed success in their prosecutions. They represent an attempt to create global justice standards that respect human rights, but their limitations show how difficult this project remains. The continuing debates about crime and punishment in democratic societies show that the questions raised by medieval justice remain relevant. How should we balance the rights of victims against the rights of the accused? How much power should the state have to punish? What is the purpose of punishment? How can we prevent crime effectively? These questions have no easy answers, but engaging with them thoughtfully, informed by historical knowledge, including knowledge of the horrors of medieval punishment, is essential for creating just societies. The challenge of addressing historical injustices committed under earlier justice systems raises difficult questions. Should modern societies apologize for past injustices like witch hunts or Inquisition persecutions? Should victims be officially exonerated or commemorated? How do we balance acknowledgement of past wrongs with the reality that modern people and institutions are not directly responsible for what their ancestors did? Various societies have addressed these questions differently, with some offering official apologies and others remaining silent. The role of forgetting and remembering in relation to medieval punishment is complex. There is value in remembering these histories, in understanding what humans have done to each other, in learning lessons that can help us avoid repeating past mistakes. But there is also something to be said for not dwelling obsessively on historical horrors, for focusing instead on building better futures. Finding the right balance between remembering and moving forward is an ongoing challenge. As we conclude this examination of medieval punishment and its legacy, we must acknowledge the complexity and ambiguity of historical judgment. We can recognize that medieval practices were cruel without simply dismissing medieval people as barbaric or ignorant. They were operating within different frameworks of values and knowledge. We can appreciate the progress that has been made in developing more humane justice systems while remaining aware of continued injustices and failures. We can learn from history without claiming to have transcended it completely. The horrific truth about medieval punishments that we have explored over the past 3 hours is not simply about the past. It is about human nature, about what we are capable of when fear and power combine, about how justice can be corrupted to serve the interests of those in power, about the importance of protecting human dignity, even and especially for those who have done wrong. These lessons remain urgently relevant in our own time. Medieval punishment was a system based on terror, on the public display of suffering, on the complete domination of the human body by state and church power. It rested on assumptions about justice, crime, and human nature that most of us now reject. But elements of that system persist in our institutions, our attitudes, and our practices. Understanding this persistence is necessary if we are to continue the work of creating justice systems that are truly just, that respect human dignity, and that seek not simply to punish, but to heal and to prevent harm. The legacy of medieval justice is thus a mixed one. It has shaped modern legal systems in both positive and negative ways. It has provided cautionary lessons about the dangers of cruelty and unchecked power. It has also left lingering influences that continue to manifest in less obvious ways. By studying this dark chapter of history honestly and thoroughly, we equip ourselves to recognize and resist injustice in whatever forms it takes, medieval or modern. That is perhaps the most important legacy we can take from this difficult history. You've just witnessed 3 hours of medieval brutality, but the darkness of human history goes deeper. Next, discover the forbidden secrets buried beneath Antarctica's ice, or explore the ancient Egyptian underworld, where gods judge the dead. Subscribe and let the next mystery find you while you sleep.